Emilee Saldaya is the trailblazing visionary leader of the modern-day Freebirth revolution. She is the founder of Freebirth Society and host of the Freebirth Society podcast. Emilee started her birthwork journey in 2003 and witnessed the fundamental fracture when women gave birth within the medical system. Rather than look the other way, Emilee chose to be the resolution she wished to see and is reshaping birthing culture as we know it. And you can find out more about Emilee and all of her work in the show notes and, of course, during this episode. Emilee, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, honored to be sitting with you, having this discussion. It's been a long time coming. You participated in the Way Forward Summit when we first kicked off as an organization discussing this exact topic, but that was a private thing, and I think this is something that needs to be shared publicly, obviously, and I know you share those sentiments. So because what you discuss is inherent to your journey, I think it's really appropriate that you just share your trajectory with your introduction to the birthing world.
Yeah. So all of this begins for me 20 years ago. I'll give you the cliff notes, but I get called to adventure very early. I drop out of high school. I moved to LA at 16. And it's a cute story because my mom, when I told her I was going to withdraw from high school, she said, that's fine, but just have a plan. Don't go work at McDonald's, have a plan of your life. And I was like, that's totally fair. So I stayed up all night, a fresh 16, just thinking, what matters? What really matters? And this is reductive. I was 16, but at that time, I kept going back to mother baby. And the true story is I had a friend in high school who had recently been gang raped. And I knew about it, and I was her friend. And I watched the underwhelming response to it. And I kept thinking all night, what could prevent that? How could we stop that? And it's really the continuum concept. There's a whole book on it, but it just kept tracking back to, an adjusted, healthy young boy. Well, what requires that? Again, reductive, it's more than just the mother, but a healthy, adjusted, well-attached mother. Okay, so how do we do that? So I kept cycling on that all night. And I woke up in the morning and I Googled baby touch, baby massage. Didn't know it was a thing. There's an infant massage training in LA. And I was like, all right, I'm going to start there. So I go out. And it's pretty radical because I got an illegal apartment. I'm 16. I'm a total minor. Mm-hmm. And I figure out an apartment. I figure out a job, pretty much avoid telling anyone my age. And I take this infant massage training and I fall in love with this idea of respectful touch and what it will do for the mother-baby bond. And then I start volunteering with a nonprofit who, they're basically massage therapists that provide loving touch to people in hospice, right? So end of life. That shifts me quickly into working in infant hospice, which is about as hardcore as you get, right? And there was something about my youth and my fearlessness. I don't know. There was something about it where I was really willing to sit in that and to be with these families. And I had such little life experience at that time. But I'm sharing all of that, as the pretext to where this goes, because it was really powerful to sit with mothers, fathers too, who knew their babies were dying. Sometimes it would be open heart surgery, babies coming home, being in the care of their parents for the first time, like 4 months old. Either way, very intense, very overwhelming. And these parents basically had no confidence with their babies because they were, totally in the medical world. Anyway, so I would come in and essentially teach them Reiki because it would be way too intense to touch the babies full on like a healthy, thriving baby. And so we didn't call it that, of course, but it was a lot of just holding space, really, and supporting this mother to drop in, to reassociate touch with love, and to really reset their energetic fields. And I just saw so quickly what happened when I showed up for a mother in that way. And this big turning point for me was this one mother called me. I had done 3 sessions with her and her baby. His name was Simon. And he had a big open heart surgery scar and wouldn't let anyone touch his left foot where all the lines were. So shut down, so traumatized. I mean, almost lifeless a lot of the day. And after 3 sessions, she called me crying, and I was worried something had happened. And she called and she said, Emilee, I've been doing the routine, and he just let me touch his chest for the first time. And I just felt him relax into my hands for the first time. And I was like, wow, this is actually really simple. Like, it felt like I was touching this holy grail that I didn't understand yet, but I knew I was getting close to something big and powerful and simple. So very quickly from there, I was so young. I had a lot of big sisters, and they started having babies. And so I started getting invited to those births just to serve as the little sister. I took on the doula role. So I went to a bunch of home births, and they were with medical midwives, but that was what I was taught was that was as good as it gets. The most alternative, intervention-free, hippie way to have a baby was in the woman's home with a medical midwife. And so I happily served and fell in love with, all that is birth and women birthing. And then I went to my first hospital birth. And this was a big, the first handful of births I had seen were pretty undramatic, pretty mother-led as far as I knew at that point. And one of them was my baby sister in Hawaii outside. Dolphins were literally jumping as my baby sister is born. Wow. Pretty epic initiation into birth. That was my very first birth, actually.
Wow, that was your first one.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It's pretty wild. Yeah, literally outside.
So you always, just real quick, so that means at your journey into the birthing world, you did always have the, I guess, for lack of a better term, preconceived idea of like what birth could really look like if it was truly away from the system altogether. I guess what I'm getting at is you always had that in the back of your mind to compare against.
I would say there, I think for many of us called to birth, there is, I can only describe it as a calling.
Right.
And because of the way I was initiated, meaning my first birth was in Hawaii with my family. I got, to hold my baby sister and sing her first song while her mother went and showered. It was very undramatic, very, it was perfect, really.
Right.
And so, we are the sum total of our experiences, right? So that was my initiation. Who knows if my first birth had been a traumatic C-section, how that might have veered me off the path.
No, and the reason I bring that up specifically is because most women that venture into the birthing world and then end up, let's say, even on, so in support of Freebirth, which we'll get into, have come with a lot of preconceived ideas on the, let's say, negative side of things, on the more medicalized side of things.
Yeah, I was ignorant.
And so what's amazing is that you had the foundation of what a truly free birth outside of the medical system could look like.
Well, I would say not quite, because these were with medical midwives.
Okay.
And now in hindsight, having the language and experience I have, there were interventions. They were not free births, but they were still beautiful.
Right.
And as far as what my thermostat setting could handle and knew about at 16, 17, 18, 19, this was as good as it gets. So I was initiated into home birth. I mean, it's all birth, right? Any which way, it's still birth. And so then I go to my first hospital birth. And now this is, next layer of initiation. I now understand what I witnessed was a very, very classic, very average induction into coerced, totally unnecessary C-section. It was several days. It was very dramatic. It was very painful to witness. I loved this woman very much. She was a friend of mine. She wasn't just, all of my clients become friends, but, she was a woman who was in my social group. And they told her after 2 or 3 days, and this is in Los Angeles, they told her that it was just obvious that based on the ultrasound and based on what has happened so far, this baby was definitely 11 pounds. And there was just no way this baby was coming out. And so she concedes with lots of tears, and she has the baby surgically, and the baby is 7.5 pounds. And I walked away from there and walked into the parking garage in Kaiser Permanente, and I hadn't slept in 3 nights. And I got on my knees. It was a gloomy day. I just can so remember it. And I got on my knees and just looked up at the sky and was like, it's on. like whatever that was evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to commit my life to understanding it and to, I had this feeling of like, oh, there's so much more to this than what I could have possibly understood prior.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this just warrior cry inside of me rise that was like, it's on.
Mm-hmm.
So then we veer into, this is part of where my work now is helping women think a bit faster on the track. But what goes on to be 10 years of serving really heroically as a savior, trying to reform. A classic tale. And so for the next 10 years, I become a very busy, very proud doula. Go to a lot of births in every single setting, from accidental side of the road, to every possible setting. Obviously, birth center, home, and hospital, but then a lot of other interesting places. So births all the time. This becomes my life. I also start to apprentice under a medical midwife, and I'm going to births with all the medical midwives because I'm getting hired as a doula. I also start a nonprofit that is providing free doula support to all sorts of women who otherwise might not be able to access them. So we're working with incarcerated mothers, we're working with drug addicted mothers, teen mothers, all different populations. And I'm also going to births in the county hospitals, seeing some of the most, inhumane, gnarly, denial of treatment, just gnarly treatment. And I'm also going to some of the nicest Beverly Hills hospitals, seeing the same thing.
Mm.
And so I spend years confused, basically. And this is where I think, a lot of birth workers will relate to this. It's complicated because I'm making money. I love these women. There's a pure thread in me. I love mothers and babies, and I want to see healing on this planet. And I know how good it can be. But then I'm also going to this wide, spread of types of births. So I'm seeing the home birth where almost nothing happens to her. And I'm tracking, this is a decade, right? I'm tracking, the joy and bliss that some women experience. And then I'm seeing obstetrical violence and rape with instruments and gnarly, brutal traumatic wounding and mutilation. And then I'm seeing medical midwives at home births, do bizarre sabotage. And then I'll hear what they say behind the scenes. And I hear, I'm seeing the nurses change the information on the chart. And I'm like in the background, right? So I'm seeing and picking up on a lot of unethical stuff, let's say it that way. And I have nowhere to turn. All of my mentors are within this very system. And so I'm trying to go to my doula mentors, my midwife mentors, and they're all like, no, honey, we serve who we can. We do what we can. Shh. And I'm like, well, that doesn't quite feel right. Like that doesn't, okay. And I have no language for this. There are no podcasts on this. Right. There's no one's talking about unassisted birth, which obviously we'll get into.
You didn't even know that was a thing. You were just looking at like, this is not right. What I saw, again, at the time, and I know there's deeper layers to this, but what you saw with the first birth that you were at, was like, that's it. Like again, I could see where even if that's where, we'll get into this, where most women stop, like that is still very clearly way better than this. So you had these two contrasting pieces in your mind. You're like, I don't know how to describe what that was, but it's clearly not all this evil shit that I'm witnessing.
Well, but then where the plot thickens is I'm going to more and more home births with medical midwives, which is supposed to be the cream of the crop.
Right.
And I'm seeing, objective mistreatment. I'm seeing clear birth sabotage. I'm seeing rules and regulations get in the way of good care and of doing what the mother wants. And again, I don't have the language yet. My body knows it. I'm going home, and it was normal for me to go home after a birth and cry for days and, process with my husband. But anywhere I'd go to these doula support groups and try to talk about it, and everyone was like, that. Like,
Yeah.
at least we're there. And this is a really common thing you'll hear in the birth world is, hey, at least we're there to hold her hand. Okay. So this is going on, and I'm becoming more and more disillusioned with medical midwifery. But to your point around unassisted childbirth, at that point, I had only been indoctrinated into mainstream birth. I didn't know anything about like the stuff I do now. And so I'd say about once or twice a year, I would have a family call me and say, we are going to birth at home. We're actually not interested in having a medical provider, but we would love a doula of sorts. And you know what I would do? I would just fearmonger the shit out of them.
Wow.
I'd play the script. I remember this one specific father and me saying, oh, so you want her to bleed out and you're just going to be the only one there? Because I was taught to say that.
Wow.
I was taught.
And just to analyze your psyche at that time, because I am convinced the overwhelming majority of people with their conditioning as context are coming from what they think is good intentions. It's not like you were maliciously, you know what I mean? It's like your intentions based on your conditioning at that time were, okay, I need to try to figure out a way to get this dad to understand that this is super risky and super dangerous because you thought at the time you were looking out for the best interests of mother and baby. Would you say that that's accurate to some degree?
I think on some level, I probably believed that. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to make it clear to people that irresponsible and that dangerous, that I would have nothing to do with that.
Got it.
I was a proud, successful doula who worked for the busiest midwife in Los Angeles, and I don't do that kind of stuff because you're done. You're not, I mean, we'll get into this.
So it's like an authority and somewhat subtle superiority complex too, in a way.
100% superiority, which is a huge aspect I hope we get into today. But the proud birth worker knows best, just like the doctor, just like the midwife, right? We're here to save you. Listen to us. This is my field. And it's incredibly condescending. It's incredibly infantilizing. And I'm embarrassed that that is a part of my story. And it very much was. So I'm bringing that up now because there was an undertone, as there probably always has been, of women who were so crazy, they would just birth at home. Now, of course, it's allowed if there's a hurricane and it's on accident. Then you'll make headlines about how brave and courageous you are. But if you admit that that's intentional, burn the witch, right? So, yeah. So that kind of brings us up to the 10 years in the system. And every now and then I'd hear a whiff of an unassisted situation, but I understood that to be outside the realms of acceptable behavior. And of course you have a medical provider there. But then, so that's what I'm taught. That's what I take on as a young, impressionable, new doula and all of that. And I'm in this community, so there's belonging, right? I have social clout. I have this nonprofit. I have volunteers. There's a lot of things happening for me. I'm making a lot of money. All these things are going on as I develop my identity in this community, right? And it's going against the birth after birth I go to with these supposed cream of the crop, as good as it get midwives, where they are abusing women. They are transferring women for no seemingly real reason. They are walking in saying horrible things to these women. And I'm kind of treated, especially because I'm so young, I'm kind of treated like I'm surprised at what people did in front of me. Mm-hmm. I saw a lot of gnarly stuff that, I don't know, you'd think they'd at least try to hide it a bit. But maybe because I was so young, fly on the wall, doula.
Can you give me some examples?
Oh my goodness.
Like with medical midwives, and I'm speaking in terms of like what I'm looking to get at for my audience of, so these midwives who are, medically trained, but that are attending home births, and we think that's more natural leaning. So could you just give me some examples of some of the things that you saw at that time?
Like the birth sabotage?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the last ones I attended, so this is 10 years ago, because we're going to get into the next 10 years. Right. So this is still a while ago, but one of the last ones really stands out to me where this couple, young couple, both in school, both work for nonprofits, barely scraping by, and they decide to have a home birth, and it's really what she wants for this baby. I volunteer my services. I just love this couple. And they scrape together. They actually sell their car and they scrape together the $5,000 for this midwife who, unfortunately, I recommended. And they pay her and they bring her on. And again, as good as it gets, prenatal care, whatever is fine. We get to, she's term. She is 41-ish weeks. And, you know, for anyone who doesn't know, in the US, there is a limitation. Although in places like Washington, there is some variance to this, but for the most part in this country, 42 weeks is the cutoff gestationally that you're allowed to stay pregnant. And if you have the audacity to still be pregnant, which ironically, or I don't know if that's the right word, but what is true factually is that it's very common and normal actually to still be pregnant at 42 and give birth into 43, sometimes even 44. And so these babies are basically doomed because they have an eviction notice, right? Which is quite dangerous and all of that. So she's 41, and a classic medical midwifery tale is now the midwife is like, well, honey, I mean, I want you to have your home birth. So you're going to need to do some stuff. It's referred to as natural inductions, which is a misrepresentation. It's birth sabotage. So she convinces her to drink a bunch of castor oil. Now, what castor oil unfortunately does, if it works, which I use that term very
air quotes for those listening, works, air quotes,
is it will give you brutal diarrhea. Just what every woman wants to head into potentially, you know, days of work. So this woman did get very serious, explosive diarrhea. She was also puking. Basically, she got really sick. And, oh, I'm sorry. This is, okay, I have this. So she takes the castor oil before the midwife's there. I'm with her all night. She's throwing up. She's pooping. Oh, weak. It's hard. It's hard to watch. It's so sad. And then this woman walks in.
The midwife.
Yes. And the first words out of her mouth is she walks in, she looks at me, and she looks at the mom who's like on the ground in the bathroom. And she goes, there's no way this happens at home. Those are her first words.
Wow.
And she was right. Right? Of course. There was no way that it happened at home. Perfectly healthy, normal woman. Yeah. So unfortunately.
Did she mean like, okay, this is going to be transferred to the hospital? Okay. That's what I assumed. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I used to serve a midwife who got so scared about meconium that she just started artificially rupturing everyone's bags when any birth started to get good patterns. You know, they would call it in the system active labor. When that seems like it's occurring, she would just say, honey, let's go ahead and open up your waters. And they do it with an amnio hook. It's incredibly dangerous. It can lead to so many complications and emergencies. It is a protective bag on purpose, right? And it opens when the baby is ready for that. And so she would just start, it's called AROM. She would just start AROMing all of her clients just to make sure there was no mech. And if there was a presence of meconium, she would transfer them at that time. And if there wasn't, they'd be allowed to stay. Now, of course, there's no transparency around this. This is surprise. We're going to do this, whether you like it or not, if you want my support. I mean, we could fill the entire time telling you the horror stories, but I think what's important to say for anyone new to this subject is if we go down to the basics, a medically trained person in obstetrics, which is what medical midwives are trained in. It is obstetrical training, even if they're home birth, doesn't matter. They are trained in pathology. They are unfamiliar with the true physiological sequence of birth and how to protect it. What gets really complicated is they don't know that. They think they know normal birth. All the while, they are agreeing to interrupt it and disturb it with Doppler, with vaginal exams, which have no statistical, scientific benefit whatsoever. I mean, on and on. The rules and regulations of what is required to be with a woman at home as a licensed medical provider. It's a long list. It's basically the same throughout. It's generally the same throughout the world, really. It's all pretty much the same care, of course.
Just like allopathic medicine, mostly the same throughout the world. Right. Okay. I want to set some context first, and I want to look at this as like layers, if you will. because there may be, I don't imagine at this point that there's that many people in my audience who aren't at the least familiar with things like Pitocin and epidurals and things like that we typically see inside a fully medicalized birth inside a hospital system. But in the case that there might be, and we want to give people the full package, I would like to visit some of those things at first, sort of peeling back the layers of that onion to then land at Freebirth. So if we could start with just explaining what an epidural is, what Pitocin is. I don't think we need to get into the injections that are given to babies. I think that goes without saying for those that listen to my podcast. I'll probably cover that with another person sometime here soon. But let's go into some of the things that you commonly see inside hospitals.
Like a typical hospital birth.
Yeah, typical hospital birth, and why those things are problematic.
Yeah. So you might be familiar with the term cascade of interventions.
Yes.
And so essentially what that means is in the hospital setting, I mean, I would argue the cascade really starts in pregnancy. It starts with the routine ultrasounds. It starts with the testing. It starts with setting the groundwork, for a medicalized birth. You have a medicalized pregnancy into a medicalized birth. So a really common track is that in third trimester, she starts to go in for regular ultrasounds. If she has any sort of label around high risk, or if there's any sort of flag for any reason, which is extremely common, too old, too young, too fat, too skinny. I mean, you name it, we can find some reason.
Especially with so many people having
first baby, VBAC.
Well, and even aside from all that too, so many people nowadays have quote chronic diseases, and again, they are having symptoms of illness. But the point is, so many people are perpetually ill, which then the medical system considers them to be high risk as well. So those are all within the category of high risk. And I think it's probably like at this point, 1 in 2 adults that means are then considered high risk to some degree, which is wild. So that means they're coming in for routine ultrasounds every so often. And I don't remember specifically off the top of my head. And for anyone listening or watching, please correct me on this if you go look into this. But there are some studies that have been published showing a correlation between the number of ultrasounds and then learning disabilities for that child after the fact. Okay, so you're aware of that too.
You can also just look with your eyes. Look at the playgrounds today.
Right.
Versus when we were kids.
Right.
I mean, it's not the only factor.
Right,
of course, it's not the only factor, but it's not a factor.
Right.
Yeah. So it begins in pregnancy where you are groomed for, to be a yes woman, to submit and to just open up to whatever doctor says. Right. And if you give any pushback, and if you are in any way inquisitive, or expecting any sort of autonomy, it's extremely likely you will be labeled as non-compliant and you will be punished. And I say that really, really seriously. So I'm bringing up the cascade of interventions because it's going to start at some point in the third trimester where she'll come in and the ultrasound will, the person making stuff up from looking at the ultrasound will pick a card, whatever's kind of trending right now, low fluid, big baby, things change depending on the decade, and kind of what's, how little sicknesses trend or different cards that they play. So she goes in for an induction. So what she thinks is her 39th week appointment, honey, I'm really sorry to say this, but I think, with this low fluids, it's just not appropriate to continue this pregnancy. And for the baby's safety, we need to induce the labor. And, this would almost be funny if it weren't so tragic. Then they'll send them home because it's the weekend, They'll start this super serious needed thing a couple days later. Anyway, when she arrives at the hospital, and this is one of my many critiques about the treatment in obstetrics, is she will be pitched an idea that she's just going to do a little something. We're just going to do a little bit of pit, or we're just going to just do a little gel on the cervix just to get things going. And then you want that natural birth, no problem, of course.
Yeah, a little bit of pit, what she means, a little bit of Pitocin for those who aren't familiar.
Pitocin, yeah. So of course, they're always going to start at 2 millunits. That is what they will start at. Everybody starts low, and then you bump it up every 20, 30 minutes. So the cascade of intervention simply is starting somewhere, depending on if she is in the birth process or not. So if she's not, they're going to start with things like either Cytotec, which, side note, is the abortion pill. They just give it to women ready to, get the baby out. So either Cytotec, which is oral and incredibly dangerous, or Cervidil, which is an internal gel on the cervix. And then they will take what can only be described as a torture device, and it's called a Foley balloon, and they will shove it inside her body and attempt to pry her internal organ, the cervix, open. And should that be successful, then they will move on to Pitocin. Pitocin is given, through an IV, and it is, it's synthetic. I can't say it's synthetic oxytocin. That it's not. It is a drug that is attempting to mimic some aspects of oxytocin.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. And so what it is meant to do, and usually does, is it forces the uterus to contract. And so this is also given postpartum. What women don't know is that if you birth with medical midwives / in the hospital, you are almost guaranteed. Of course, there's exceptions, obviously, but the common treatment, the expected treatment, is that you will receive Pitocin if you're on an IV for 24, sometimes even 48 hours postpartum. And if you're in a home setting, you'd be given a shot and potentially more. So we move into Pitocin, which almost all women will receive at some time in their stay. If you do the classic, I'm in birth and I show up at the hospital and I'm already having contractions, they're not going to call it an induction. I would still call it an induction because they're augmenting labor at some point.
Right.
After the Pitocin, which sadly, one of the biggest downsides, well, there's many, but it is most commonly experienced as excruciating. So you take already the bigness of birth, which has its own physical experience, and you hyper shoot it up. I mean, it's an artificial experience. You
Right.
can't really compare the two. And so it's reported to be extremely, extremely painful.
Right.
It's really dangerous to the baby because you are forcing the uterus to contract without the natural biological rests that are inherent to normal physiological birth. And so it is not uncommon for the baby to stress out. It's going to get less oxygen. It's dangerous to the uterus itself. And so at that point, it's very common for an emergency C-section to occur. Baby will often decel, and also if you've never seen a hospital birth, I mean, honestly, it's pretty accurate what you see made up in Hollywood. A woman is strapped down. She has tubes everywhere, straps everywhere. She's being given drugs. And this is all pre-epidural. This is just being admitted. You get your IV port, you get strap for you, strap for baby. You have to be in the bed or else the straps will fall off. And we just don't have enough staff tonight. Mm-hmm. And on it goes. I mean, it's so much. There's so much that happens even just from triage into your first hour. Right. You will receive several vaginal exams, whether you like it or not. And it's really quite intense. And of course, you're in a hospital gown. And in bright lights and with strangers and all the stuff
sterile,
that's
not a warm, welcoming environment whatsoever.
It's really, really interesting that women are so willing to continue doing that.
Right. It's because they don't know any better, and that's why we do stuff like this. That's why you do what you do. So we'll get to that, and then
then the Pitocin will be so painful, and from the get, the staff has been saying, you don't get a trophy for a natural birth, just get the epidural, or the anesthesiologist is heading into a C-section in 15 minutes. So if you think you're going to want the epidural, it needs to happen now. I mean, long laundry list of ways that they coerce.
That's basically what Kylie was told with our first, is something along those lines. Like, hey, hurry up. You're a nuisance to us right now. Yeah, you're making it more difficult for us as a staff. And it's like, what?
It is so much. I mean, think about it this way. It is so much easier for a small staff of nurses to be able to sit and gab and eat behind looking at screens because everyone is drugged up and laying flat like little, like in the Matrix, makes me think of those incubator things. Like they're all laying down on monitors, catheter, tubes, drugs, everything is getting measured on the screens versus a woman in the shower screaming for more orange juice and moving around and asking for hip compression and where's the ball? And I heard you guys had a mirror, they don't have the space for that, even though they are labeled baby friendly and they promised you that in the childbirth education class that you took, right? It's so scammy. It is so out of integrity. Like, let's at least be honest and see if the women come. Right. So after that, of course, it's totally understandable that a woman would now like to disassociate. She is being abused. She is being humiliated. She's going through all the rituals, of the system that are incredibly demeaning. And she would now like to take the carrot that they've been dangling.
Right.
An epidural is a combination of a narcotic and a local anesthetic. So, analgesic. I'm saying it weird. And so, yeah, it numbs you if it works. It also doesn't a lot of the time. And then it also, it's just a real crapshoot because every doctor has their own cocktail that they like to do. And depending on your unique body and how you respond to that said cocktail, I've seen women so high that they thought there were birds in the room who could not talk, who were and then the narcotics, can cause, you've seen a crackhead on the street. Right. A lot of them start to, it's really, really, really sad.
And it's incredibly sad too, because seeing the flip side of that, and I know this goes without saying for you, but how incredibly lucid women can be during that experience as they're supposed to be.
Come on.
With the birth of their new baby that is coming out of them. And it's such an empowering thing for women. To be so disassociated from that is so incredibly sad in hindsight for those women who can even go there in their mind. I mean, you hear that all the time, like, I feel awful about my birth of my, son or daughter in the hospital because I got an epidural and I don't even remember any of it. They don't remember that like core moment of seeing their own baby, of
they were on drugs.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're on drugs.
So, we are a people who are being born on drugs. We're dying on drugs. This is the way of these times, for the vast majority. And also, I just want to reiterate that it makes a lot of sense to want to disassociate in an abusive setup.
Totally.
So, what is so like the great secret about birth that I love to share about is that birth is designed to be blissful and ecstatic. And it is one of the most potent opportunities to meet God, and of course it's suppressed. Of course, women's power is drugged. Of course, we're indoctrinating babies from the get to, be drugged and be separated. And of course, right? I mean, it all makes a lot of sense and is quite brilliant, really. I mean, in a deeply nefarious, evil way, but truly brilliant. And it's been really epically successful. And it's pretty recent. We're only talking about 100 years that women have been willing to leave their homes. So I like to remind everyone of that. Like, you might have this big story that you're a C-section baby and your mom could only have C-sections and her grandma maybe had C-sections. But before that, all of your ancestors gave birth, and they did it without drugs, and they did it without, most likely, being abused and tortured. So, yeah. So just to finish the cascade of interventions really quick. So an epidural would require that you have a catheter, you're on the bed, you will have some amount, if you're lucky, if you get what you are wanting, some amount of relief. The idea is that you'd be able to sleep and let the drugs finish forcing the baby down. But some women, the epidural will happen so high up in their chest, they'll feel like they can't breathe, so they have panic attacks, and they need more sedation. It's a real crapshoot of what's going to happen to you. And then after that, they will break your bag of waters. And after that, they'll just kind of keep rocking all that on your body until they either decide it's time for surgery and that you just couldn't do it, or somehow your brilliant body and baby could still somehow come down. And then they would wake you up and say, based on our monitors and based on these vaginal exams, you need to push, even though she can't feel anything. And then at that point, they might cut your perineum to make it go faster. They might shove forceps deep inside your body and clutch onto your baby's head. They might have an internal monitor on your baby's head, which screws into the baby's head, actually screws into it. They might use a vacuum extractor. I mean, I saw a doctor one time literally walk in. She looked up at the clock. She had the vacuum in her hand. which is a very violent delivery. And she walked in and she looked at the clock and she said, I have to pick my kid up in 30 minutes. And she walked in, she sat on the stool, she didn't even acknowledge the mother, put the suction on the baby's head and pulled the baby out, cut the mother and then pulled the baby out, and was probably there in time to pick her daughter up. So I'm seeing this multiple times a month for years in my 20s, just to catch us to. And then we didn't even talk about surgery, which is incredibly common.
Yep.
Yeah, it happens all the time. Like, it's no big deal to have major abdominal surgery.
People will even elect to have them. That's the crazy thing.
Of course.
Like, especially in Brazil, I think that's the highest concentration of women who elect to have C-sections on a certain date, which is insane. Insane.
Yeah.
And of course, like, I know we'll get into this, emergencies, like the very, very, very true emergency, those situations, that's why, and this applies outside of birth too, the allopathic medical system is sometimes, and I put a big asterisk, underline, like bolded letters on sometimes, good in some true emergency circumstances.
Well,
sometimes.
I appreciate that. And I do want to say, though, that any reason a woman chooses to birth any which way, I genuinely support and think is totally valid. I have served women who have chosen elective C-sections. And, I found out later one of my saddest, most humiliating birth worker stories was I had a lot of judgment of a woman who did that, and I tried to talk her out of it. Very embarrassing. In hindsight, I'm a much better birth worker now, but back then I was very righteous, and I made up that she just didn't know and that she was being fearmongered by somebody, whatever. And she has the elective C-section, and I'm with her, and I'm faking it.
Judgy.
Oh yeah, I'm faking it. I'm going through the motions, but afterwards I went to drop off something and see her on day 3, and she invited me into the nursery where she was holding her baby, and she said, I want to let you know why I chose to do the C-section, because she was real, didn't want to talk about it prior. And I was like, no, what are you talking about? You don't have to explain anything to me. I'm just such a faker. Mm-hmm. And she says, no, I really want to tell you. I'm like, okay. And I sit down and she says, I was raped. The baby is not so-and-so's, the husband. We do not believe in abortion. It's not on the table for me. And we decided that we were going to raise this baby. And I, obviously felt like I got kicked in the stomach. Had never occurred to me that there could be those, not to suggest that's the only reason that would justify a C-section. I'm just eliciting, the growth, the humility that is constant in birth work. And she said, I could not bear the thought of having this baby pass through where I was assaulted. Yeah. And I have to love this baby and raise this baby. And I just couldn't associate the two. And this is what I needed to do to mother this baby. Okay. Yep. Never considered that, So I'm sharing that really hardcore story because there are as many reasons as there are women, right? And it's so immature and righteous to think that we know what we would do in people's shoes. Right? You have no idea what you would do in another person's shoes. And I'm saying that at the start of this big triggering conversation around free birth, because I fundamentally stand for wholeheartedly women to live their lives, to claim their lives in the way that they see fit. And the risk assessment that each woman makes and calculates for herself and her family is unique. And I see that again and again and again and again, because of course it is, right? So in my personal principles and values, I am not interested in using the medical system shy of perhaps a broken bone, situation, a small, so like to your point, a small group of reasons that I would be very, very grateful to engage in the medical system. The issue is that the authoritarian, fear-mongering, predatory system that's also the place you go to for a lot of help or for when you don't know what to do in your birth is also the place that abuses you. You do not have informed consent. That is a complete myth. And that is out of integrity. It is unethical. And I have a huge issue with that. Does that make sense?
No, that totally makes sense. And I really appreciate that too, especially you discussing that, okay, what you do with Freebirth Society, and I know we'll get into this, is you give the full spectrum of like, hey, here's the truth about this.
As far as I can understand it.
As far as I understand it.
Yeah.
Here's the truth about this. Here's the truth about this. Now, you as a woman,
live your life.
Given all this knowledge, make your own decision that is best for you based on your own risk assessment, your own consciousness,
or worse
conditioning,
for
whatever.
you.
Or worse for you.
Whatever
right.
it is.
Whatever. Like you make your own decision.
Your life.
Right. Exactly.
And if you have a prophylactic, not medically necessary C-section, there are going to be some costs to that. Right. And that's totally your right to do it. Just like choosing
but be truly informed, though. That's the thing.
If you want to be.
Yeah.
You don't have to be.
Yeah.
This is like you said at lunch about being educated. And I don't think that women need to be educated to have a biological function. I didn't need to learn how to have a bowel movement to allow a bowel movement. I don't think that all reasons are valid, period, around how you're going to allow or not allow your biology to unfold.
Yeah.
And birth is a biological function. You can interrupt it. Most women interrupt it, right? If you just stay home, your fate is free birth.
Yeah.
That's your fate if you're pregnant. At some point, the fetus at whatever stage, whether it finishes its life in your uterus or it is alive and ejects itself, if you just stay home and don't invite anyone over, your fate is a normal physiological birth.
Right. Well, this is a really important point, actually. You just reframed something to me, and I see where even my conditioning is coming out to some degree with respect to birth, because it's like what you're doing is helping people unlearn,
right?
Decondition.
Yes.
Because I just thought in my head, relating it back to like having a bowel movement, right? Which is a normal biological function.
For most.
Just like birth is a normal biological function that beings have been doing across time for thousands, potentially millions of years.
Literally forever.
For as long as time, right? Literally, that's the only way we're here. What came first, chicken or the egg? That's another conversation. But point being that it would be akin to, okay, pooping is a normal function of a biological being, right? It would be akin to, here's the problems with pooping in a toilet. Just so you know, here's the problems with conditioning someone to be so fearful of that normal biological function that they do a bunch of stuff rather than just trusting their body. Like, no, like this is normal. This is what human beings do.
And you could, having a bowel movement is really a great example because in some ways they're not that different. They require some of the same hormonal sequences, and they both require privacy and time and, all these kind of interesting comparisons. And every now and then you hear of a story where someone needed some help pooping. Right? And you hear about a compacted bowel and you hear about someone that died from not being able to poop. Those are real stories. I saw it on Alone. Someone had to get kicked off the show because he couldn't poop. Okay?
I love that show, by the way.
Me too.
It's like one
obsessed.
of the best. Yeah.
Anyway, so I have this cartoon I want to create. So if any of you listening know how to do this, please let me know because I don't know who will do this with me. But I have this cartoon I want to create that's like a little short. And it's basically a world a culture where the people all on their way to work and as they drop their kids off at school, they stop by on the corners and it's like 7-Elevens everywhere and they stop by and get their poop extracted. And it's just what you do. And you do it on your way. And it's just a normal part of this society that you have essentially colonics, though I don't think it would be called that in my cartoon, but it is just normal to have your bowel movements extracted as you start your day. And, if you ever start to feel a little crampy or a little rectal pressure, you might go and stop by the 7-Eleven little corner store again before you go out that night. And then the story would, of course, follow someone who had an accidental poop. And it just happened at home. Right?
I love this analogy.
It just happened. And does she tell her friends that it just happened? And she kind of keeps it secret for a while because, it's like pretty crazy. Like, and whoa, like, did she almost die? Am I okay? And she's like going through this whole spiritual experience. And then the next day she just doesn't go in and she just poops at home again. And then the next day she just poops at home again. Anyway, and on it goes that it's this cartoon of this woman or man, it doesn't matter, realizing that they can just poop. And then they start trying to spread the word and everyone's like, demon, shut her down, death threats, all the shit I've gone through.
Right.
And, and it is her just enacting her biology in a society that has forgotten, right?
Yeah.
So there's this term cultural amnesia that is so applicable to birth. And I also just have to say, because it's just so fascinating, like birth is this epic elephant in the room that like, why is everyone not talking about it? It is the one common denominator that we share with all living beings. Maybe there's others, but like it's the most obvious one, right? We are all born, literally, without exception. We all come in through this word called birth. And it inarguably massively affects us and our imprint of who we are in this world.
Amen.
Right?
Yeah.
And, no one really touches it. It's interesting. And it's just time. It's time we touch it.
Yeah. Time we touch it. So well said. I love that analogy. And someone needs to make
funny?
that card. It's perfect.
No one steal it. I'm making this cartoon.
Good. That's great. You just need someone who's good at drawing. Yeah. An animator. In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes. And then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. So I want to continue on though. So with all that being said, the context that we gave about like, again, it's a woman's choice to do what she wants with her birth experience, to be educated or not educated. I would like to continue on with educating on C-sections themselves. So a friend of mine, Ayla Cuenca, she, I guess you could say she doesn't practice as a doula anymore, but she just does birth education as well. She's a good friend of mine. And if I remember correctly, she cites the statistics of one of her friends who is a midwife. And I don't know if she's a medical midwife or not, but the point is, I'm just making a point with respect to C-sections. Out of the 1,000 natural births that she had attended, only 8 of them ever ended up in C-section. I'm just making a point here, contrasting against hospital systems. In some cases, it's upwards of 30 to 50 to 70% in some cases of the births in those hospital systems end up in C-section. Mm-hmm. So outside of the very rare exceptions that require a C-section in emergency cases, true emergencies, which we'll get into, can you share why electing to, again, and no one's judging, no one's shaming the choice, but just sharing information objectively, why C-sections are problematic? Which is crazy. We even have to like explain why a major surgery of a woman's abdominals, explain
and
why
it's not just the major surgery, it's replacing birth with surgery.
Yeah.
So replacing birth, well, first we have to understand a little bit about birth. There's a lot to say, but for this question, I will say that there's a very specific sequence that is designed for mammals across the animal queendom that results in an optimal, thriving mother-baby connection. The real obvious cliff notes is when sensations start, the mother starts to release hormones. This is very rudimentary what I'm about to do. It's obviously a bit more to it if we had the time, but sensations occur. That is going to release hormones in both mother and baby. And then as the baby comes down, the baby is going to prepare for birth. And as they go through the birth canal, they're getting cranium pressure that is going to release more hormones coming out of their fontanelle that then the mother is going to smell. That's going to help release her prolactin, which is breast milk. And so as the baby is coming down and born, then we have this placenta that intentionally held on to some of the baby's blood volume. It's not extra blood. It is the baby's blood. It is fetal blood. And then as the baby transitions, and there really is and you've seen it, obviously you have children, but there's a very real transition. Some babies come out vigorous and transition real fast, but others don't. Both my babies took a long time to transition where they were fully in their body, fully breathing with their lungs. And so as that's happening, the placenta is delivering essentially a blood transfusion that its intention is to get the organs online in the torso. It's being released to the baby at the pulse of the mother's heartbeat. And the baby now has this, let's just say 5 minutes of kind of in between worlds where they're allowed to transition in a really, I say gentle, but it is just nature's design. It is how it goes, that there is a transition period. The placenta gives the blood and the baby will begin to breathe. The baby will claim its life, right? This is, and then we move on to now the placenta, the baby. Let's stick with humans because now I'm like, should I say it for all? It is pretty much the same, but let's stick with humans. So then at some point, the next thing we have to do, the birth isn't over, the placenta has to be birthed and the baby has to nurse. Only then are they really done, right? Nursing needs to be established. And so now in this perfect setup where the mother and the baby had all the time for the placenta to fully give the rest of its blood, it's really quite romantic. It has all this time and now the placenta is ready to release and it peels off the uterine wall and it is ready to be born or birthed, whatever. And the mother will get crampy. And maybe at this time, we're talking in the first hour, the baby might have shown some suckling interest. Now the baby is suckling at the breast, which is also going to help create contractions for the placenta to be birthed. Now the placenta is out and now the baby is latched and nursing. And the mother and the baby are having the most significant fireworks of hormones between the two of them through eye gazing, smell, heat regulation, like through every single thing that's happening in a naked, undisturbed, 3-foot halo around them, undisturbed situation. The sequence, the intended sequence that leads to a contented infant and a well-attached mother is what I'm describing. Mm-hmm. So we have to first understand what a normal birth cycle is and why it matters. So I'm going to call what I just described an intact birth. Okay. That is intact. There's so much more to it. I could, talk about this all day, but we'll get back to the C-section question. So what I just described is an intact birth. This is without anyone Dopplering the baby or pulling the baby out or rubbing the baby or bulb syringing the baby. This is hands off, mother baby doing their thing. So now we go to your question, and I would say, yes, surgery we can get to, but any interruption of what I just described, there will be a cost to it. Mm-hmm. And there will be let's say a fracture. That doesn't mean, and this is what's very sensitive, and sometimes I can get misinterpreted here. That doesn't mean that you won't bond to your baby. Mm. There are infinite ways to bond to your child, and it's never ending, right? And this is so important to know because I work with a lot of mothers who have birth trauma, and they're so upset, and they feel so guilty, and they feel like they've ruined, the whole thing, and they struggle to bond, and they struggle to feel. Oh man, I just did a session with a woman right before I came here, and she was telling me about her C-section and in the days afterwards that she would just look down at her daughter and she would just go, I can't feel anything. I can't feel anything. Like, why can't I feel anything? Well, it's hard to feel when you're detoxing from that amount of drugs alone, not to mention the trauma, the surgery, the disassociation. Like there's so many layers to it, but literally just the drugs you are on is going to suppress. It is understandable that you wouldn't feel, but I digress. So surgery is the biggest interruption possible, right? Not just because the baby is born by knife, but when a baby is born by knife, so many of almost everything I just described doesn't happen, right? So in a best case scenario, which is not very common, but in a best case scenario, she could maybe have some sensations, like if she was already in the birth process, but then she'll be drugged, born by knife, and the baby is not going to be like suckling on the mom. She's going to be sedated on some level, sometimes fully unconscious, sometimes groggy. And then this is all assuming the baby doesn't go to the NICU, right? And a lot of mothers, because they're so groggy and so disembodied, they don't want to hold their babies right away. And it's all very forced and performative and awkward. And it's just so sad. So just talking about the sequence alone, not even getting into how we feel about it, just like the facts, like this is the physiological and hormonal sequence that is designed for birth to unfold and unfold well. And it tends to result in a contented, thriving human. So when you birth by knife, the chances that you won't be able to nurse are incredibly likely. Now, some women are still able to nurse, and that's just what a magnificent body we have that you can recoup, after all of that. But many women are not. Then, of course, there's the social layers of there being suggested to formula feed from the get. And there's all sorts of, nefarious agendas with the formula industry and the NICU stays. And there's so much to this. So it's not just surgery in a vacuum. It's when you birth in a hospital, how many people are touching your baby, bathing your baby, injecting your baby, whether you know it or not.
Right.
I mean, side note, I've had so many nurses whistle blow what they've participated in, regardless
Even
of
if
what
the mom is like, hey, I don't want any.
Yeah.
We're going to take them for this exam real quick.
Yep.
Right.
And I know of games where the nurses who thought women who didn't vax, should be taught a lesson, they would have games and keep score of how many kids did you give this shot to the moms who didn't want it. So there's so much to it. It's not just the surgery, though the surgery itself is major because the baby is not going through the physiological, biological functions of how to learn how to breathe, how to receive all the blood, the first smells. I mean, there's so much. Yes, it's kind of crazy. We even need to break that down. And there is a lot more to say about it.
It's crazy. Can I make one point real quick? I've heard from several women who've had C-sections that, and then have turned out to have a VBAC afterwards, that the child that was born via C-section struggles to integrate sort of primal reflexes, one, and then two, is a little bit more emotionally unstable than their other kids, which is interesting. And I'm sure there's other things too that are
sicker
common.
More often, anxious attachment. I mean, of course, right?
Because it's also the microbial input that the baby receives coming through the birth canal as well that you're missing off.
I mean, it's everything. Yeah. It's everything. It's so many layers. Oh, it's spiritual, it's every single layer. And I say this also and babies are incredibly resilient. And of course, children can still be healthy and happy and contented. It's not, because, this is where we talked about this at lunch. Like people will hear this and they'll only apply it to their one experience or to this one friend that they know or something like that. But we can't. We have to think bigger than that. We have to zoom way out. And what's so interesting about where I sit in my work right now that is pretty unique is that I have been in the sovereign birth world for 10 years. And so I have been tracking sovereign, undisturbed birth results for a decade. So now I have this, it's all anecdotal, although we are working on our first planetary study, worldwide study. That's for you, bud.
I was waiting for you to say that. Continue.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll just skip over that.
We don't have to, but yeah. So I am partnered up with a really amazing research team, and we are doing what will become the largest worldwide study on physiological birth ever done. So I'm super excited about that. And that'll be in the new year. But anyway, so anecdotally, from where I sit, from the tens of thousands really of stories now that I have tracked, I have some pretty interesting results. Again, anecdotal. I can't like prove it to you. This is just like in my brain and in my lived experience. But that's where I get really excited about the shift that is happening, because people want to, attack it and tear it apart. And it's like, well, what's happening is happening. And it turns out birth seems like it's kind of meant to work. And when left alone, it seems like it does most of the time. My elder midwife, Sister Morningstar, has this quote that I think about a lot. She says, well, you don't see the forest floor full of dead deer, do you? Like in birth, Right. And no, you don't. I've never actually seen that. And I live in the woods. There's hundreds of deers where I live. I've never seen a mama deer die while giving birth. And I've never seen, I know stillbirth happens in all mammalian species.
And we'll touch on that too.
Yeah. Anyway, I find that very inspiring in a way to kind of reconnect to the wildness that we are.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's like really important that we covered that context. And again, I think for most people that goes without saying, everything that we covered there with respect to C-sections and epidurals and Pitocin. But one thing that I want to add more context on is there seems to be this narrative that, we need to be considering birth to be a medical procedure, and we have more advancements in healthcare and things like this. And if not, women would be dying in droves, or babies would be dying in droves if we didn't have this system in place. And again, I say that while recognizing there are true emergencies, very few, but true emergencies.
They're rare, though.
Very rare. And that's my point, in which it is great to have this as a resource. But again, they're very rare, and we'll cover that later on. But I want to share some stats real quick. So the United States ranks poorly in maternal mortality compared to other developed countries. In 2021, the maternal mortality rate in the U.S. was 32.9 deaths per 100,000 live births, with significant racial disparities, by the way, which is interesting. But compared to 10 other developed countries, the U.S. has the highest maternal mortality rate and one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. Likewise, U.S. infant mortality rate, the U.S. ranks 173rd amongst 227 countries across the earth, and is one of the highest in terms of infant mortality. In fact, amongst European and North American countries, the U.S. ranks 43 out of 45, so is by far one of the worst amongst developed countries, quote, developed nations, right? All of that while the United States spends significantly more on healthcare when compared to other developed countries, by far more than other developed countries. And in fact, if I remember correctly, if you take the countries just below the United States and combine their total healthcare spending, the U.S. still spends more than, I think, the bottom 3 or 4. And I don't know if that's entirely accurate. But point being, the U.S. spends an absurd amount of money on healthcare, right? One of the most, quote, developed countries with a sophisticated, well-researched, well-funded, well-trained medical structures in place, and still has one of the highest infant mortality rates and one of the highest maternal mortality rates. So I just wanted to add that as context before we get into what for many can be a triggering topic, and that is free birth.
Yes, and a lot of the maternal death rate is from surgery, which has to get presenced as we talk about maternal death, because bleeding out on the table is different. A manufactured hemorrhage from an unnecessary surgery that kills a woman is included in this. And that is a huge leading cause of why mothers are being lost. And this is part of why I mentioned the study I'm working on. I'm really curious what we're going to see, because I can say anecdotally, I've never heard of a mother dying in childbirth in the sovereign birth world. Now, I want to say, as I say that, of course, I don't know every single birth. I don't know everyone on the entire planet. Of course, it's possible. But what I am aware of, that is undeniably interesting, that in the sovereign birth world, we aren't losing mothers. That's interesting to me. And that's something I'm really excited to get actual data behind. Now, it's also, do you mind if I keep going on this?
Keep going.
So I also just want to say something I think about or think on a lot is in the natural birth world. And when I say that, I mean, women choosing pregnancies without medical management and birthing without any of that. We do see natural death. We see stillbirth. Stillbirth exists. I've never seen a system that has been able to eradicate fetal demise. Now, keep in mind, the first 10 years I worked in the system, so I saw stillbirth all the time in the system. Or really what I should say is pregnancies don't always end in live births. That is true for all mammals across, the planet. So I haven't seen any one way that has fixed that issue. But in the natural birth world, there is only natural death. But what I think is important to talk about and shine a light on is in obstetrics, there is both natural death, of course, but there's also murder. And this is very real. I'm not saying that, to be...
You're not saying that lightly.
No,
very real murder.
I've seen it. I've been in the room with 2 different deaths. One was from an ECV. Do you know what that is?
No.
Where a baby is in a breech presentation and the mother agrees to allow someone to attempt to rotate the baby so that she would be supported to birth, because otherwise it's an automatic forced C-section. And as the person did it, my understanding of what happened was the placenta got pulled off. As you don't know the setup in there. It's mysterious. And my guess of what happened is it was a caused placental abruption and the baby died. And then another time was, in my opinion, I don't know how else to slice it. It was from the Pitocin. They kept going up and up and up on the pit, and the mother was getting no breaks. And I think what I saw was the baby stroked out and died.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I know the baby died. That's a fact. They told her that her baby just couldn't handle labor and she should have had the C-section in the beginning that they recommended.
So they shamed the mom.
Of course. A lot of it depends on how compliant you are.
Yeah. So
the most horrific treatment that I've witnessed were from mothers expecting some level of respect and autonomy. Really dangerous to come in with that level of expectation. Like if you start talking about your legal rights, be careful, girl. Mm-hmm. I've seen some gnarly stuff happen to those people. Anyway, so yes, that is all really important. But then there's also this, really just powerful myth in our culture that everyone was just dying before obstetrics. Like we all have that in our consciousness. That is a really powerful, successful myth that still is very alive in most people's consciousness. That was based off of studies that have been debunked again and again and again, but no one cares, mm-hmm. Right? It's too powerful.
Yeah. More people are caring now.
I hope so. Yeah. So what I see in the sovereign birth world is, look, from the moment life is sparked, that spark of life has a time expiration date here. We don't know when that's going to be. Mm-hmm. But I've worked in birth for 20 years, and pregnancy loss is not uncommon. I would actually even say stillbirth, I wouldn't call stillbirth rare. It happens. And if you hang out in a mothering community, you will see it. You will know women who experience that, who walk with that story. And again, what I think is interesting about my walk of life here is I did 10 years in the system and now 10 years out. So I have this kind of interesting, balance here to look at, look at this. It happens everywhere because of course it does. Not, I don't think it happens more in the sovereign birth world, but I don't have any actual data on that. Mm-hmm. This is just what I see.
You'll get it though. You're going to get the data.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. So before we get into free birth, unassisted birth, I want to, again, we're peeling back the layers. There's now for many women who are understanding of the problems with the hospital birth, some of them still, choose, and I respect that decision to, okay, I'm going to still birth in a hospital because I'm still, I won't speculate on what is truly going on there. From the way I look at it, they're still wanting that reassurance, let's say.
Even if it's an illusion.
Yep, right, correct. And choose to birth in a hospital and just like, okay, I'm not going to have any of those interventions, but I still want to give birth in a hospital. And then there's like another layer above that. And it ultimately leads to, for a lot of people in this space, is that they're like, okay, I want to do a home birth and I want to hire a midwife though. And my midwife is more natural leaning. But this presents the problem that you speak on so eloquently and so directly of you can't serve two masters. And I'd like you to just share some of the common things that midwives who are licensed, right? Medical midwives, as you call them, have to abide by if they would like to maintain their licensure.
Yeah.
And this all goes back to when I say you can't serve two masters, it's either that you are serving your licensure and you don't want to lose it, so you are following those guidelines, or you are going to serve the woman that is giving birth that you are attending to. So,
and therefore betraying your license.
Therefore betraying your license.
Most likely.
Right, exactly. So I'd like you to share some of the common regulations.
Yeah. First, I want to say that it's pitched to us that hiring a medical midwife to come to your home is the best of both worlds, right? So the pitch is, and it kind of depends on the flavor, but a lot of women really love, and families really love the idea of bringing the hospital to them. Like, how cool. I can have all the stuff other than an OR. I can have all the stuff that a doctor does, but I can have it in my home. And many women love that, genuinely. Yeah, bring the oxygen tank. Let's do it. Now, then there's another group of women who don't want the hospital being brought to their homes. And they think when they're hiring a medical midwife, they're getting the grandma that knits in the corner. But there's this cognitive dissonance for all parties involved. This idea of the best of both worlds implies I can have the grandma knitting in the corner in case something happens. Mm-hmm. And if I'm one of those women that needs something, she's also a medical provider that can save my baby and me, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't exist. That's not real. That is a total lie. And really, I think it's I think it's really a con, actually, how it's pitched, because so many women, what my coaching practice is full of is women who learn the truth about their medical midwife by way of their birth being sabotaged and discovering that everything they were sold in the prenatals and in the interviews isn't actually available to her. So all of that really does somewhat come down to the license, though, of course, anyone can sabotage a birth. Right. I'm not ever going to pretend that all unlicensed or sovereign midwives are some like angels that know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. There's as many situations as there are people, right? Of course. So the issue in reference to this, you cannot serve two masters, is that when you involve a licensed provider, you have a third party who ultimately is the deciding factor of how she behaves. So a classic example, and there's many, but let's just go to some classic ones. And one of the biggest issues here is they aren't transparent. So women are discovering this at the end of their pregnancy. So it's very common in our country that a medical midwife, a licensed midwife, is only allowed to attend a woman if she falls between 37 and 42 weeks. So if her waters, let's say, begin leaking at 36 weeks and 3 days, that the obligation of the medical midwife is to transfer her into her obstetrical practice that she's in relationship with, is usually how it goes. Of course, there's some
hospital that they work with, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Which I'll say there adds another layer of lack of ethics, because lots of midwives what they're doing at the birth is about setting up to not piss off the OB in a transfer. So an example of that would be if the woman's waters are open. Let's say she's term, though, in this new scenario. She's term, she's cruising, her water's open, and it's been 24 hours. Ugh. Okay, so what is supposed to happen in most places is antibiotics, need to be started, whether she likes it or not. And if the mother doesn't want it, the dynamic now is going to get tricky, because if the mother doesn't want the antibiotics, now the midwife has to be thinking, okay, so if this goes another couple hours and I transfer her, if I'm going to transfer her into Dr. blah, 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 and I'm going to be showing up with someone without antibiotics and she doesn't have 12 hours on this, that's going to piss him off. And I need to stay in good relationship with him because he takes my transfers. So there's politics to it. There's dynamics to it. So much more than this little example, but
this is one of many examples.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with this mom being like, I don't want antibiotics. I don't do well with them. I don't want them. They make me sick. Doesn't matter. So the coercion, tactics, again, I've seen so much of, is really an interesting element to this, because in some ways I could make a case for medical midwifery abuse being worse than obstetrical abuse in the hospital, because on some level you expect drones in the hospital. Like, you kind of know that it's like assembly line to some degree. But in these situations, you eat with this woman. She plays with your kids. She spends time in your home. She might even do rituals with you on healing your, surgery, trauma. Yeah. And she might come to your women's circle. And then she violates you in the bed that you made the baby. That is a different flavor. That is also getting into sister on sister violence, woman wounding. It's just, it's very deep. Yeah. So another example, would be if the woman doesn't want to get a GBS test with a medical midwife. So she might just not want it. If she is positive, the standard of care is that she would receive antibiotics, and a certain amount, it fluctuates depending on where you live.
With my wife, she was, quote, and this was in a hospital, she was, quote, strep B positive. And she had 6 rounds. We actually just reviewed the record, 6 rounds of antibiotics at birth. Like, that is, that might, like, I think a lot of people focus on the shots that kids receive, but there's not a lot of focus on that. Like, what does that do, especially to a baby that ends up in C-section that was pumped with an epidural? What does that do to the baby?
Well, sometimes it kills them. It's quite serious.
At the very least, it like completely ruins
their gut health. Of course.
Exactly.
And the mothers. So, okay. So let's say she doesn't want the GBS test. Well, we're in the age of informed consent, right? Like, you're hiring someone. Of course, you can say no to a test. Also, she told you could say no at the beginning in the interview. But now you don't want the GBS test. And she's going to say, well, I really support your choice to decline. And I'm cool with that. I understand that. I didn't even choose it for myself. But if we transfer and they don't have a GBS status on you, they're going to assume you're positive, which means that in a transfer, you will be given prophylactic antibiotics, whether you like it or not. And in a worst case scenario, if you show up too late in the game to receive the 12 hours, they're going to keep the baby for observation. And you don't want the baby to be kept from you, right? Let's just go ahead and hope we get a negative.
Oh my goodness.
That is like classic script.
Yeah.
So many women are listening to me right now going, oh my God, that's exactly what my midwife said to me.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I could keep going. There's so many.
Yeah,
the 42
weeks,
the open waters is a big one. The biggest transfer stuff in the birth process is, it's just been going on for a while.
Right.
And, oh, honey, I want you to have energy to push. Huh? So you're just going to transfer me to the hospital after I paid you $5,000 and thought you were going to be, anyway, but that's not a rule and regulation. Here's one. So it's a rule and regulation that is quite common around the country, is that once the woman enters the pushing phase, you need to Doppler her every 15 to 20 minutes. Well, what about if the mom is in the tub and she's bending over her husband and she, is hard to get to? Well, she better change positions and accommodate that. And so this might not sound like a lot.
Right.
And this also, I have to say here, like, as women, as mothers in a society where we are groomed for subordination and sexual assault from day one, it might not, the bar is so low. And this is why medical midwives at the home, I think, get away with a lot of this, because if your first birth experience is like a horrific induction into C-section, what do you have to complain about if you got a couple vaginal exams you didn't want, and if you had to wind up pushing on the bed, even though you were really liking the intimacy of being in the pool with your husband? What do you have to complain about? Right? The bar
relative
is
to the bar being so low. Right.
That makes so low. Yeah. And so women gaslight themselves and until they don't. And my practice is full of women going, I just kind of need to talk this out because this one thing happened that now in the middle of the night, when I wake up in a panic attack, wondering where my daughter is, I realize it's because my midwife took her away for 30 minutes and I didn't have a line of sight to her. Could that be real? They're so confused because everyone around them is going, you had a healthy baby. It's
not
so
a big
sad.
deal. Right,
it's so
right, exactly.
sad. The bar is so low. I mean, they're low with, choosing men, right? Like across the board, the bar is just so low.
Totally.
So
with that, with all those examples, and again, I know you could go on and on and on. So this now, I want to present two things. And one of which is like, I know both a friend of mine who is, I'm not going to say his name, a really well-known doctor who chooses to keep his license, is a licensed pediatrician, but he's a pediatrician who, again, according to the licensure, they would say that you are supposed to do these series of things with these kids that you're seeing in your practice. He's like, fuck that, I'm not doing it. And he actually says for his practice, he's like, we don't do that here.
Yeah.
So there's that. That's one. And then the other is, I have another friend who's in school to become a doctor right now. And he is fully aware of the problems with the medical system, like fully aware, on the same page about virology, all of it, right? But he's like, I want to do this because I would like to be able to waive that paper and have the sort of license and the credentials, because unfortunately where we're at with society right now is that the majority of society, even though a lot of people are waking up to natural health and the fraud of the allopathic medical system, still have that conditioning of, oh, you have credential before or after your name, therefore you know more than the average person would know.
And all he's done is double down on that.
I know.
All he's done is prove and deepened the condition.
Right. And I'll say this too, like, it's not the case anymore. And we were talking about this before we clicked record, but when I was, 2 years ago starting to speak on virology, and I felt that I was quite proficient to speak on it, right? I would get a little bit frustrated sometimes, and now I don't really experience that anymore, that I would not be invited into places, and I would actually have people tell me like, sorry, we'd rather have this person speak on it because they're a doctor and you're not. And I'm like, but I'm just as proficient and knowledgeable on it as that individual is. And in some cases, I'm more knowledgeable than they are on that. And now that's not the case anymore. But I thought at the time of like, man, maybe I should just go back to school to be a chiropractor so that I can at least have the doctor in front of my name. So all that to say, I'm not saying it's a justifiable excuse. And that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying I could see whether you're the individual who's going to school for that, or, wanting to be a medical midwife for that reason, or someone who's still medical midwife. So they're like, okay, I can reach the people who still think this stuff matters and still give them the natural stuff that they want. And I don't really give a shit what my license says to do. And I know there's problems with that, which I want you to comment on. I'm just throwing a lot at you and I'll let you comment. I don't really give a shit what my board says and the licensure says. I'm not really going to do any of that. I just have the freaking piece of paper so that I can check the box. And so that for the people who still want the credentials, I have that. So all of your thoughts on everything that I just said.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your willingness to blaze your own path, an area of expertise, and you're proving the point I was going to make, because you created, what's the word? Credit without the letters.
Yeah.
Right? You've done this long enough. You built enough of a platform. You got enough people to listen. You learned enough and you spoke enough. You got the attention and wound up in the same places. Right? So that's also me.
You too.
Right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, you as well.
I appreciate that about you. I think a lot of it is what do you want to devote your life to? Do you want to be a part of building a new paradigm, or do you want to be a part of the reform, and be a good guy in the broken system? And I will say, on a spiritual level, I think that's kind of dangerous. I tried it, totally get it. But that is fundamentally out of integrity. And so there's a lot, that we could say there. I know many, many women believe they're going to be the unicorn midwife is the term. I really think I know that they believe that. I have women in my school all the time. And they're like, love everything you're doing. I'm going to practice just this way, but I'm still going to get licensed. I'm still going to also do this so that I can, serve everyone. And so that I can straddle both worlds and I can bring this sovereignty into the system. And Okay. It won't have the same impact because you're still enabling the system you think you're fighting against, which I've really learned through my own, life story. Also, you are going to get up at odds and put yourself in potentially dangerous situations. By choosing to be licensed, you are putting yourself on the map in front of a board, in front of an entire state, saying, hey, I am this. I am a licensed medical provider that takes this oath and that follows this stuff and pays my dues, and I do follow all of this. So then to not do it, I mean, that's risky. That's dangerous. I know some midwives that do that go to jail. I know midwives who do that, medically trained midwives who have betrayed their license and got caught, right? And lost their license and their reputation at that and had to start over. Yeah, of course, do whatever you want. I don't really see the point of that. I don't think that's the most efficient way. I think a lot about efficiency. Like, what's the most efficient way I can create change?
Right.
And reform ain't it.
Right. I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that response. And I still hold out for that, because I can't put myself in the shoes of each unique individual, that there are those unicorn midwives out there, possibly. Like that there are. You're smiling. You're saying maybe, okay.
It's because
I
it's
still
a lie.
hold out hope that there is.
No, it's a lie. To me, and anyone's welcome to disagree with me, but to me, it's not possible, because you cannot practice in true integrity and hold a license. You can't do it, because you cannot be completely loyal and serve this one family. You can't. And if by serving this family, it means that you're betraying your license and putting yourself at risk, that has energetic cost to it.
Right.
That you are in an integrity breach.
You're in a contract. You're in a contract with the state.
It's not the highest, cleanest way to serve each other.
That's fair.
I also understand that people believe it gives them protection. That is not my opinion, but people, we were just talking about this in the car about, what was the thing you said about the
Overton window.
Yeah. People are doing what they're up for. Let's put it that way. For some reason, I'm up for a lot. I'm willing to put myself out there and do something pretty edgy. I'm up for it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't come with some, risk and some scariness. And, I've really had to learn a lot and really raise my thermostat setting to stand in the fire. Most people aren't up for that. And so they're going to toe the line. And being licensed is towing the line. That's not building a new paradigm for the new earth. No, it's just not. And you can still be a good person. And this is, again, where people misinterpret me. Like, of course, there's good people doing everything.
And again, there are still...
But you move the needle at what you're up for.
Yeah.
So these people you're referencing, they can totally be brilliant at what they do, and they can affect change, and they can help people. And of course, but they're moving a needle, I would say, a bit slower than what I'm interested in.
That's helpful to hear, because this kind of relates in a way, and I don't want to go off on a tangent on this necessarily, but I just had a conversation with Derek Bros about voting itself and like about politics and people running for office. It's like, yes, sure. I'm not saying that people can't affect change from within the system to some degree, but what about us just exiting and building outside of the system to make the system obsolete and stop believing that the system has legitimacy and authority? That itself would move the needle a lot further, a lot quicker.
Welcome to my world.
I totally hear what you're saying, and I relate it back to government, because those are the sentiments that I have.
But it is government, Alec.
I mean, yeah, it is. It's another form of government. It is. You're right.
License is
you're right. Yeah. No, I don't disagree. And then the second thing that I wanted to touch on was, so what about those women who, several of them have seen the same medical licensed midwife, and all of them share amongst them, like a group of friends, that we've all had positive experience and there wasn't really shit going on with this. Like I've had a positive experience, so I don't see any issues with this. I just trust this. I trust this woman. I don't trust that she's a medical, like it has nothing to do in their mind with them being a medical midwife. It's that, okay, I know several friends who have had this same person. Yeah. Again, in the role of a woman attending a birth, and I feel comfortable with her as the woman attending my birth.
So first, I'd want to know their standard, because we just talked about a low bar. what is the standard of this group of women for a good midwife? Right? That would
Fair
be my
point.
first thing I want to know, because we can all be coming at this from super different angles, right? Like, did she really show up without pharmaceuticals? Really? Did she really not bring pharmaceuticals into your home? Did she not Doppler you and blast your baby with ultrasound technology? She never did a vaginal exam. She never, like, was she a shamanic?
Yeah, what does this mean?
And
Like,
also,
that's
I'd
a good
want to
point.
know, okay, so first, what's the standard? Second, because we just covered, women are comfortable with a lot of shitty treatment. Second, why is she licensed? If she is so into like autonomy and well, what's the deal there? And then thirdly, I want to say it means a lot when a group of women refer someone. That's powerful. I would be interested in that midwife. Doesn't mean I want her at my birth, but it is meaningful that several women, speak positively about this midwife. And then my follow-ups would be, what's the standard? And then why is she licensed? Because, yeah, I think that's self-explanatory.
No, that's fair.
Right?
No, that's very fair. That is a very fair question.
We haven't even covered what is free birth.
No, I know. Well, remember, I'm peeling back the layers here. Like, I'm trying to get to free birth. Okay.
Oh, one other real quick thing that was lingering for me around the license is I also just wanted to name, beyond licensing, we still want to talk about training. So what is the ethos in which this midwife is, traveling in? Is she in a medically trained consciousness? And do you want that? So again, can't have both. You can't have the grandma knitting in the corner who's also the medical provider. That's not a real thing. And so there are women who are unlicensed who are medically trained. For me, I would want that as far away from me as possible. But the background in which this woman comes from matters to me, because that's how she learned about birth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
totally.
that's
I mean, it's just like the classic example of what I brought up with my friend who's going into school. He already has the understanding of the true foundation of health. And again, we could speculate all day on whether it's the right move to go to school and get the credentials, knowing that he has the true understanding.
There's no right.
Right. So like, that's his choice, right? Yeah. And I understand. I can put myself in his shoes because I was there 2 years ago. I understand that. I do. I understand that. Right. It's what he's up for. But I look at much of the so-called natural health approaches, naturopathy, chiropractic, Ayurvedic, traditional Chinese medicine, all of them at this point, even homeopathy to some degree, and the common schooling that we see, the common training, the common education, it is coming from an inherently flawed, completely unproven premise on the true causes and the way to approach someone who is sick.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the exact same thing.
Right. And so that, even if they think they're more natural leaning, yes, like of course, that compared to a standard doctor that is operating in the allopathic medical system is better, but sometimes it's not. For example, I look at functional medicine doctors who position themselves, and this doesn't apply to all functional medicine doctors, and I know functional medicine can mean a lot of different things these days, but just in general, functional medicine doctors who position themselves as being natural, right, more natural leaning, all the while, what they do is a patient presents himself, they just give them some labs, which are non-specific, which are subject to change literally 24 hours later, then make a bunch of determinative decisions with a diagnosis, putting the fear into patients' mind, and then prescribing them a crap ton of, okay, we're not doing pharmaceuticals now, but we're doing these supplements instead that are also intended to just mask symptoms or suppress symptoms and not address the root cause. And it's almost worse in that context because it's under the guise of a more, quote, natural approach to health.
Yeah, you just described medical midwifery. Also, you made me think something probably worth saying to a mother who might be considering medical midwifery. Another part of the rules and regs that really bothers me, because I think it's incredibly dangerous, is active third stage management. So the birth of the placenta. So once the baby is out, active third stage management means that the mother will not get a 3-foot halo. She will not get the time to naturally bring her baby into life. the medical midwife or apprentice, whatever, will begin the process of vigorously rubbing, suctioning, and also getting the placenta of the baby, and then also getting the placenta out. And so this could mean pharmaceuticals. Most of the time it does. It means getting shot up with Pitocin, like we said, but it also means tractioning the cord and getting the mom out of the tub. So moving her. It's a lot of disruption in that important. You hear about the golden hour. Everyone talks about it. No one actually gets it or honors it. And so it's just a really different consciousness of what you may or may not want at your birth. And because our bar is so low and women have been kept away from this knowledge, however we want to frame it, been pretty ignorant to how our bodies work, let's be real, they don't even know that it's dangerous. So when I attend birth, like for example, I would never resuscitate a baby. That's cuckoo bananas to me. I would never, ever get involved with a baby coming into life between mama bear and the child. That's so dangerous to me. But sorry, the point that I was going to make was women don't even know what to ask because they're not, most women are not yet at this place where they're even going, what do I want? Mm-hmm. Their bar is so low. I just want my baby to survive. I just want to have a baby. I just want this to go good enough. Right. And maybe they dream about a natural birth. They don't really know how to get it. The doctor says, yeah, totally. We're baby friendly. And it's all just a big ruse. Right. So getting clear on what you actually want and then having willingness to have those conversations and then knowing how to feel your body and can you smell the bullshit and can you, feel the red flags. Talking to women who've birthed with these people is huge. Tell me the story of your birth and really listen for what the midwife did and didn't do and how she shifted, the energy of the space. Anyway, yeah.
I could ask endless questions related to all those disruptive techniques. I'm like, okay, what is the intention of that? What is the intention of that? What is the intention of that? And I'm not sure. I think that likely there's a lot of conditioning involved, obviously, but these are coming with good intentions initially, maybe when they were first developed. But the point that I'm getting at is all of those disruptive techniques are coming from the flawed belief that birth is a medical procedure, birth is a medical emergency, and that nature itself, God, spirit, the one mind, whatever you want to call it, didn't create us as perfect beings to begin with that already know how to do this. That's the premise that these techniques are ultimately based in if you keep peeling back the layers.
I would add that the medical provider is needed.
Yeah.
And so she then has to prove that she's needed.
Right. Well, but what is that ultimately based in as well? It's based in that birth is an emergency
flawed,
and it's
she
flawed.
Is needed.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all based in
she's
that.
She's the hero, the savior.
Right. And that we are imperfect, that God didn't create us as these perfect biological, spiritual, emotional, electric, water-based beings that have this perfect, just innate capacity to heal and self-regulate and to do the processes that we were ultimately designed to do. It's based in the idea that we are flawed, that is not true. And that's where it's coming from. And you've shared this before on some of the things that I've listened to you talk about, is that it was only 2 to 3 generations ago that this concept of what is now referred to as a free birth, really just an unassisted birth, a sovereign birth, was the norm. That was the norm 2 to 3 generations ago, or at least a home birth outside of, assisted from a medical professional was there. Maybe not free birth was the norm, but you get what I'm getting at, is that
we have to call it sovereign now. It's like calling food organic now. Before it was just food, and now
before it was just birth.
Before it was just birth, and now birth. But nowadays we were talking about affirming delusions earlier. Nowadays people will say that their induction is natural birth. They confuse vaginal birth with natural birth. They'll say C-section is vaginal birth. Okay, just take a beat there.
What?
Yeah.
Say that again. C-section is vaginal birth?
Yes.
How do they?
I'm not really sure. It doesn't make any sense, does it?
No,
but there is in the mainstream birth, affirming you have to affirm everyone's, stuff so that no one feels bad about anything. There is narrative that is pervasive, that all of it is equal and all of it's exactly the same. But also the thing we're about to talk about should never be done because it's the most dangerous, right? But yes, back in the day, I assume everyone just called it birth. I wasn't alive at that time. But my understanding historically of midwifery is that throughout history, everywhere, it was very commonplace for your mother, your grandmother, your sisters, your cousins, your aunties, to not all of those people at once, but it was very common for women of your clan, of your tribe, of your people to support you in one way or another. And then it is also commonplace that there would be someone who took to birth, that it was their vocation and that was their role that they played. There's a lot of, it's hard actually to get a super clear, trustworthy aspect of this because a lot of it's been really butchered in the retellings. And honestly, a lot of midwifery text I've read historically is also quite abusive and intervention heavy, not with drugs per se, but maybe with tinctures or with instruments. I mean, I think that our culture has this kind of fantasy notion of how midwifery used to be. And I actually haven't seen real evidence of that. But who knows? I wasn't around. I've studied matriarchal societies and perhaps it was alive there. Anyway, but it is normal and common, I think, throughout humanity for birthing mothers, especially having their first baby, to desire support. And it's only in the last 100 years or so that it's become, that I'm aware of, that it's become this hierarchical medical, obviously the medical paradigm is not even that old. So yes, before we could call it sovereign because that stuff didn't even exist. There wasn't licensing.
It was just birth.
It was just birth, and maybe you had someone and
a professional, but not necessarily someone who's licensed by the state, right?
No,
adhering to the state, right?
But also not even medical in any way, shape, or form because that stuff didn't even exist then. So there were ways of doing things, and depending on the culture and the time, there was certainly trends of interventions and some pretty whack stuff, honestly. So again, I don't have this like.
Do you know where that shift occurred though? Because I'd be interested to know if it came alongside the Flexner report and Rockefeller. I assume it did. Rockefeller medicine, essentially. Yeah, of course.
So by the mid-40s, my understanding is by the mid-40s, almost all births were in the hospital in our country.
Wow.
So it began a little bit sooner, but the tick where it became majority happened mid-40s. But what's so gnarly is that the ether being introduced to the mothers, happened pretty quickly. And so women,
the ether, what is that?
Ether, like
you mean literal ether?
Literal ether.
Okay.
So women.
I wasn't sure if you were talking about a birthing context because I talk about ether that is around us all the time.
I wish
cool.
that's what I was talking about. No.
Okay.
Women being given ether and being unconscious, and then babies being pried out, and that's where the hitting the baby comes from because they were unconscious. They were not well.
Right.
And that's really the start of obstetrics. In our history, it's a very dark history, and it's really fascinating to learn about because there was so much heavy funding for propaganda to get women out of the homes and, the like alcoholic witch midwife archetype, which we still see today. The witch today is, she's evil, right? But she's the healer. She's the midwife.
Yeah,
I mean, it runs so deep, but it all is fairly fresh.
Okay. So with that, I think we finally gotten to the point to talk about what is free birth.
What is free birth? Okay. Free birth is the choice to give birth in the absence of hired birth professionals. So I know it's like a fancy way of saying unassisted childbirth, but I use that definition specifically because I would include doulas. I would include sovereign midwives. Free birth is also called family birth. It is giving birth, typically where you live, or maybe an Airbnb or whatever, but typically where you live, giving birth without involving birth professionals, whether you paid them or not, without involving birth professionals.
And then again, you would include doulas and non-medical midwives as birth professionals.
For sure. Well, of course, they are birth professionals, right? So I don't go to free births. Right.
And this is an important point too, because you are an advocate for free birth. Sorry, let me say that again, Nico. You are an advocate for free birth And at the same time, you still attend births for those who want it.
Well, you've said that a lot today, and I keep
Is it
correcting
wrong?
you. Well, I would say, if I were to say what I was an advocate of, I am an advocate for doing what you want.
Okay.
And so obviously I spend a lot of time talking about free birth as an option, and it's something I've chosen for myself with both of my children and will always choose, I'm assuming. But yes, I attend births. I am non-medical in every way, shape, and form, very intentionally. And I attend births, and I am purposely unlicensed, unaffiliated with in every way, shape, and form. Now, that doesn't mean, I want to be very clear, this doesn't mean I am acting as a medical midwife without a license. No, sir. That is illegal, and I don't do that. Nothing I do is illegal or unlawful. None of it. None of it.
Neither. It's neither illegal or unlawful.
It is neither.
And I want to be clear here. Like, I don't mean that you advocate for free birth in a bad
I'm just
context.
teasing you.
Okay. I was going to say, because you do. Like, your group is called Free Birth Society.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess
you advocate for free birth. That's not a bad thing.
But I think where I keep pausing on that is people assume that because I talk about it and have created space for the conversation, that I think people should do it.
Got it.
I don't think anyone should do anything. I have no idea how your wife should birth.
Right.
She knows.
Right.
And she's going to do the way she thinks. Great.
And I really appreciate you clarifying that too.
It's important.
Because I've heard, and I know you've heard this too, and like people say shit about me. I've heard that like, Free Birth Society, that comes across as a little bit culty. Like they come across as if you don't birth by yourself out in the woods with no one around, then like you're not a true woman.
So
and that's not what you're saying at all.
Of course not. That would be insane.
Yeah.
That would be really, really quite weird. But, people love to misinterpret. And I don't think a lot of people can handle what I'm talking about.
Right.
Honestly. I always think about, like in New Mexico, all the different rocks, the exposed rocks, and they're all different colors. Mm-hmm. There's a name for it. I can't think of what it is.
I don't remember, but it's beautiful.
Anyway, you know what I'm talking about, right? A really beautiful exposed rock. I always think about how whenever you put yourself out there, when you work in the public sphere and you're a thought leader, you're bringing forth your work, you're basically throwing your work onto every layer of rock. Right. You're just like putting it out into the public, and every layer, let's call them layers of consciousness now, every layer is going to receive it. And so I'm essentially trying to capture the top layer, the people of the highest consciousness who are critical thinkers and who are into the concept of self-responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But it's getting, get what I'm saying? It's getting exposed to every layer. So of course there's going to be different layers of consciousness that totally mishear. And it's an easy way to, discredit me. One of my favorite ones is that I lack nuance. Mm-hmm. If you've ever heard me teach about birth, the whole thing is about nuance, of course. But anyway, it's boring.
Right.
It's super boring. It's not actually what I think.
I get that a lot too. When I talk about terrain-based health, is people will say, oh, you're denying my experience, you're denying my symptoms, or you're saying that I'm bad or wrong for doing X, Y, and Z. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just sharing the principles that I've come to understand to be true based on my own research, my own unique life circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not denying your experience either.
We can have convictions and allow for other people's experiences.
Right, exactly.
But again, that takes a level of maturity and intelligence and emotional bandwidth that I don't think a lot of people have. Mm-hmm. So here we are.
Yeah.
Okay, so free birth is the choice to give birth with whomever you want, but the specific determining factor is that it is in the absence of birth professionals. And this is important. Why is that different than having a sovereign midwife there or a doula? Simply because it is different. And I really hope you guys can hear me. It's not better or worse. This is not about that. There is no better or worse. There really is no right or wrong in my perspective. There is only what we choose. And so it is absolutely different when you choose to have a birth professional in the room. It is not worse. It's a great choice if that's what you want to do. The whole thing with Free Birth Society, my company, was I got really interested in carving out space because there was none prior to me doing this. I wanted to carve out space for the women who wanted to explore that as an option, who that was in alignment for. Maybe they'd already done it and they wanted to talk about it, which is primarily what my podcast is about. And I guess I'll just give you a little brief history about this because it ties in. When I started the podcast and it went viral and there was so much interest in it, very quickly, I started to be bombarded with requests of doulas, midwives, aunties, cousins, friends going, my so-and-so has invited me to her free birth and I don't know what to do. Can you coach me? Can you train me? Mm-hmm. And so my creative partner, Yolanda Norris Clark, and I got together and we were like, we got to help orient women to how to serve in a non-medical way. And we got to teach them what we do. And so people get really confused about this because yes, it's called Freebirth Society. I'm not saying it's the best name ever. I don't know. I just made it up. But
it's pretty dope.
I think it's all right. Yeah. It would look great on a sign like that.
So the only thing that for me, and this is like my conditioning with virology, and I don't need to go off on a tangent on this, but FBS also means fetal bovine serum. And that's what's used in cell culture isolation techniques. But anyway,
we're rebranding.
This bring a new energy to FBS. Thank you.
That's funny.
Yeah.
You know, I chose that name because I was playing with this idea of what would a society look like where birth was free, where birth was autonomous, where birth was unhindered, you know, and it wound up, you know, taking a life of its own, this whole thing. I also acknowledge that Freebirth Society does sound like a little bit culty, and I didn't mean it that way. But it was a vision, right. You know, and a commitment that I work with a lot is this idea, this commitment that is to be the resolution. Uh-huh. So when I see an issue or something missing in my life or the world, am I willing to be the resolution? And what would that mean? What would that look like? And that's really the essence of me starting this, was leaving the system and going, well, I know I'm not going to birth my babies in the system. I wonder if other women want to talk about that. And I got really interested in what could it be like. I've already had, this is my 4th or 5th company. So what would it be like to start a company that was rooted in not trying to convince anyone of anything, which is really different. Because in the doula world, I was like begging women to not go to the hospital and get abused. You know, essentially that's what it felt like. And I wanted to start this field around me as I became a mother that was like, I'm just going to hang out over here and I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to walk the walk. I'm going to have my babies this way. And if you want to come learn, I'm going to have ways to engage with me. And let's just see, which is why I have the little around I advocate for free birth. Like, I really don't know that I do. I think I'm focused on what I'm doing, and it has grown into a lot of women are interested. Now, obviously, I am critical of the system, and that doesn't mean every single person in it is bad. It doesn't mean every single birth is bad. But I do think we have a social responsibility to critique systems that harm mothers and babies. And come on, that is definitely what is happening on a very, very, very large scale. So this free birth thing has always been around. I don't want to pretend, or I don't want to act in any way that I like made this up. Women have been birthing forever, and women have been birthing in a sovereign way forever, I'm assuming. What is unique about what I have done is I brought forth this idea through personal narrative, where hundreds of women on my podcast are just speaking from their own experience, which there's something really magical about that because it's inarguable. Yeah. You know, someone saying this happened to me and this hurt me and that's why I chose this. It all of a sudden gave women permission. And, you know, women all over the planet would go, well, if she could do it, maybe I could too. So Right. It really started this movement of permission where women, had more information. There was a counter narrative of women. You know, I'm not on there going, don't go to the hospital. I'm going, hey, tell me about why you didn't go to the hospital. Right. Which I think is a really kind of exciting way to spread.
It's totally different too. Yeah. And like people just sharing their women sharing their experiences.
And I was exhausted by the whole reform mentality. So I get excited about that because the whole idea of launching this company that has been wildly successful, and I'm making more money than I've ever made. I'm more vitalized by what I'm doing, and I have a bigger impact than I've ever had in my 20 years of birth work because I'm finally aligned and in integrity. Right? So
no, it's interesting you say that too, because of the doctors I know, several that I'm friends with that have said F it to their license, or maybe their license was stripped away from them. At the onset of that was really challenging. But over the course of time, they're chosen to stick with that, and they're free. They're like, this is so much better than trying to have my license and cater to that system.
There's a cost on your soul.
Right.
It's hard, man.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's tough. It's totally tough. So the couple of things that I want to touch on when it comes to free birth, and you already answered some of it, is that there is this misconception that free birth equals you are totally on your own birthing in the woods out in nature. And it can mean that. And
it
some
usually
women
does not, but
yeah. And some women, it usually does not. And that's an important point to clarify there. It's just that you do not have any birth professionals present.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of discuss the consciousness of that. For the women who have come to Free Birth Society, let's say, who've had any birth within the spectrum of birth in a hospital that had that cascade of interventions, down to birth with a medical midwife, to now having a free birth to contrast against, which again, free birth just means that there is no medical professional or professional midwife or any doula or basically any authority present. What is the difference in experience that you see across the board?
Yeah. Embodiment. Yeah. Real self-love, self-authority, connection to instinct, self-healing. It's magnificent. I'm thinking of this woman who had an eating disorder her entire life, bulimia and severe restrictive eating. And she had 2 home births with medical midwives, and it was really hard for her to allow her body to get big. It was really hard for her to navigate pregnancies with this eating disorder, we'll call it. And then she free birthed. And I supported her. I wasn't with her in the birth because she free birthed. We've covered that. But I coached her and became her friend. And she called me after the birth. And maybe it was day 3 or so. And she was crying. I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And she said, I love myself. And she said, I'm standing in the mirror naked and blood is dripping down my leg and my milk is coming in. And it's the first time in my life that I love my body. And that's what I see in 1,000 different ways.
Wow.
I see women finally get the courage to leave their abusive husbands. I see women start their businesses that they've always wanted to start. I see so much, finally put boundaries with the toxic mother, but all of this is coming down to self-trust. Because at the end of my podcast, I always ask, how has free birth changed you? What do you notice about yourself now that you've gone through this experience? And basically the answer in many different ways is, I know myself now. I've met myself and I know myself. I trust myself. I say no now. I mean, it's pretty big. Mm-hmm. It's really big. And again, I just feel like disclaimer, this isn't it's hard for, I think, people to hear this in the beginning and not put it on a hierarchy. Mm. And in some way, I'm going to contradict myself because maybe there is some sort of spiritual hierarchy here in terms of what's available in an undisturbed birth. I don't know. I mean, that's something I think about and pontificate on with my friends, all the time. But I want to be really sensitive about how I roll this out because I really fundamentally believe that and know that women are doing what they're up for.
Right.
And, there's a million ways to walk this path. And so it's not to say you can't have a spiritual experience or that you didn't feel powerful after your blah, blah, blah birth. Of course, that's all great.
Of course you can.
Of course you
can.
You're
not denying that experience. You're not denying that it was incredibly empowering for women to do that.
I will say that I have served countless women who finally birth in power, who finally birth undisturbed, where nothing is taken from them, no assessment, nothing has occurred, no management whatsoever. And they go, I get it now. I thought my natural birth in the hospital was empowering. I get it now. And that was my experience when I first attended. So after 10 years, I started saying yes to women who wanted to birth with just me, which was very edgy, right? We covered I would fearmonger people. I didn't think that was allowed. I thought it was illegal. And so 10 years ago, when I started this whole thing, I said yes to this family. Basically, the short version is I realized I wanted to get pregnant and there was no way in hell I was going to expose myself and my baby to anyone affiliated with the system. I had seen too much. I knew too much. It's a freaking toss-up. You have no idea what it's gonna, no. So I was like, oh shit, what am I gonna do? And then I realized, I think I just have to do it on my own. And can I do that? What does that mean? What's that called? I mean, I didn't know anything yet. And so pretty much in that same week that I started thinking on, I think I'm just going to invite my sister. I think I'm just going to just do it. And anyway, when I'm realizing this, I get a call from this mom and I go interview with her, and she and the husband are lovely, great connection. And halfway through, I go, you guys, it doesn't really seem like you want to go to the hospital. Am I reading this right? And they were like, we really don't, but we don't know what else to do. And I heard myself say for the first time ever, which then I go on to say it a lot, but for the first time ever after 10 years, I said, I mean, if you wanted to just stay home, I'd come. And they were like, you would? I was like, yeah, sure, let's go. Like everything just felt different. And it was connecting with being the resolution, this principle that I have really taken on. And so, yeah, that begins the rest of my life, where I start to say yes to people who want that. And why I'm sharing that story is that when I go to that birth and then every birth since, after hundreds of births, I mean, I have seen a lot of babies come out of a lot of women's bodies. After hundreds of births, I felt like I was finally seeing birth, like undisturbed, wild birth, where there was no assessment, no Dopplers, no vaginal exams, not even position change suggestions, nothing. Just her sourcing from within herself and me still being very young and not fully stepped into the midwifery role, really playing a little sister helper. And so, yes, I still had some authority. I still was a birth professional in the space, but I think women were hiring me because of exactly who I was. I hadn't birthed yet. I still was the little sister archetype. Anyway, it was profound and it was very different. And so in my own observation of witnessing women who birth in this non-medical, sovereign way, even with me, and free birth at large, I think it's available in what I call the sovereign birth paradigm. But so much of this gets down to responsibility, self-authority, understanding how we're all engaging on the drama triangle and how we're passing blame and responsibility to each other. And this is stuff I talk about a lot with the women I serve. And at this point, I'm really interested in only working with families who, are up for that conversation. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so yes, long story short, power is what I see. And I see it heal lifelong self-loathing issues, anxiety, all sorts of stuff. Now, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but there's a ripple effect to birthing in power that is undeniable. I see women go on this, it's a joke in our community. I see women go on this trajectory where, then they start to question, why do I send my kid to school? And maybe we should live on some land, and maybe I should stop shaving. Why do I shave? And, why do I wear a pound of makeup on my face every day? And maybe these high heels aren't so good for my bunions, and right. Just like, what would it be like if I said no? Like all of a sudden, all of this stuff starts to change. And that is what gets me really excited, because it is undeniably a transition point. It is a rite of passage, regardless of how you walk through the gates. Another thing that gets me really excited about sovereign birth that's worth saying, because you're a father, is the way in which the father gets to participate, hold space when there is no one else. Now, this is very intimidating for many men as well, of course. But what is available, the intimacy and bonding and healing within a marriage when a couple chooses to go through this and he shows up and holds her in her just fire walk, and of course it's not like women are fearless, so that when they choose free birth, of course not. For me with my second, I got really clear after my first. I chose to have my sister and a friend and my husband. And it was a long birth and I created a lot of drama in it. And also I loved it and it was perfect for being all the lessons, that it was. But I got really curious after that of what would it be like to be totally alone? And who am I? Who am I when there's no one else to turn to? And I just got curious about it. And maybe that sounds like weirdly hardcore. It's a spiritual quest, Who am I in the depths of this psychedelic landscape when your consciousness is integrating with the spirit world, and your entire brain is rearranging to then bring this baby here, to mother this baby. Like, who would I be? And I just got so curious about it. And so I obviously relayed that to my husband and was like, be in the wings. And I want to find out who I am, you know? And I guess what I'll share here in this moment is I healed in real time. Stuff happened in that birth. And on the outside, it would probably look like I was really suffering. I was talking in tongues, talking to God. I was God. I don't know where I was, and I was everywhere. I was puking through wormholes, and I just said yes to the massive bigness, part hellscape, part cosmic terrain that was that specific birth. And I had this moment where I was so deep in my pituitary gland, and I kept hearing this one part of my brain go, women give birth in comas. Women give birth in comas. If women give birth in comas, this baby will come out. And then this other part of me, because did you know that?
No.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
The body ejects a baby when it's time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's not a lot of women in comas at the time of birth, but there have been.
No, I get what you're saying, though. It's what that's getting at is like, if you literally just trust your body to do what it does,
there's nothing to do.
Right.
And I mean, side note, if women give birth on ether, like that is basically a induced coma.
I can't, when you say ether, I can't
It's
stop
ruined,
thinking about
yeah.
dude, for me, luckily I still have like, okay, I think of ether in terms of the medium.
But you
of
know about the 40s and 50s,
yes, I know.
right? I mean,
yeah, but when you first said it, because I talk about ether
in a positive
another
way. Yeah.
I'm like,
Okay. Well, we can come up with another word for it.
Wow. But that's incredible though.
It is incredible. And what is available in that landscape, I mean, it's hard to articulate, you know, because it is so psychedelic and your brain's releasing DMT, and, you know, you are communing with God, and it is beyond articulation. But there were these moments where my consciousness was in these 5 different layers, and there was this insecure little girl part of me, you know, who went to Catholic school and was always taught, you know, that I'm not doing it right because I'm left-handed and I hold my pen super weird. And I was always the one being like, this doesn't make sense, getting sent to the priest's office. And I grew up with this narrative of like, you're too much. And that little girl emerged in both my births. Otherwise, I don't really notice her too much. I don't feel very limited by her. But in these 2 births, as I went into the psychedelic landscape and I'm on this journey undisturbed, no one is asking me anything. No one's bringing me into my front brain, right? My forebrain. And so I was able to travel. And so this little girl, wounded, insecure, you know, part came up really strong, and she was fucking with me and wanted to, you know, doubt. And she was saying things like, your uterus can't do this. Like, you're too old, you're too weak, and saying all this weird, insecure shit. Anyway, and then the other part of me was like, women give birth in comas. But all of this is to say that as I was traveling through this wormhole, I realized that this little girl, wounded part of me was actually getting integrated. And I just had this thought, and I just said it out loud. As I was crying, I just said, I'm healing in real time. And it was like all I could say. It's like, that's what's happening. I'm healing in real time.
Wow.
And it is what it is. And I birthed my child, and he had a long transition, and he did not breathe or make any noise for several minutes. And if anyone else had been there, they would have ruined it, because they don't, you know, most people don't know how to sit. The reason I can sit in that, in the great mystery of a baby transitioning and not do a fucking thing, is because I went through it. You know, my babies took that time, and I know it, and I trust it, right? But that's a big ask for a birth attendant. What I see is women in this free birthing movement taking responsibility and dropping down, making their own autonomous choices, really investigating what story they want to tell their child. I mean, that's something I have been so inspired by. Like, I want my child to know that she could get born. That's important to me. And yes, I understand there's rare emergencies, but for the vast majority of all life, they can get born, but they're not getting born. They're being extracted, they're being cut out, they're being pulled out. And the average narrative, if someone knows anything about their birth, it's there was a cord around my neck and I almost died, and the doctor saved my life, and my mom needed the C-section and she almost died. There's so much drama to it. But on a spiritual level, like, wow, that is a broken story from the get. And so now the birth, for most people, the birth is something to overcome. And it shapes so much of how you understand yourself. So on a really, really core spiritual level, it mattered so much to me. It matters so much to me. And I'm very inspired by this idea of, what do I want at my children's backs as it shapes their entire life? And I want them to know I could get born. I claimed my life. I chose to be here, right? So what I see is women, including myself, using this as a launching pad, a catalyst for really big change in their lives, simplifying their lives. I see a lot of, like I already named, a lot of disinterest in a lot of ways of life. Once you go through this, it just takes some blinders off. And for many women, I love witnessing this. It's like, well, if I could do that, what else could I do?
It's like the ultimate gateway drug.
Yes, it's such a gateway, as it's meant to be. Mm-hmm. So there's this thing called the golden opportunities, and it's the blood mysteries for women. And the idea is that every blood mystery a woman goes through is an opportunity for consciousness raising. And man, I mean, there's a whole segue here around postpartum, and postpartum is designed for consciousness raising, and the bliss and ecstasy and creativity that I experienced in both of my postpartums after an unhindered, intact birth, gave me some of the best ideas and helped me clarify what I was doing in my life more than anything else, which is pretty counter to, it's going to ruin you and you're going to be all messed up and blah, blah, blah. This idea that birth ruins you and it breaks you. I mean, in a way, you could say it breaks you in the best possible way. My creative partner that I mentioned, Yolanda, has this quote I love, that birth will decimate you. And that's one of its gifts. Mm-hmm. And, in its pure form, it's meant to do that. But shifting to birth in the system, it's literally designed to suppress this. Everything I just articulated, it's designed to drug it up and shut it up. Well, that's no surprise, and they've been very successful at that. And it's so powerful to sit where I sit and watch these women reclaim what is their birthright, what is their God-given design, and to actualize it against great risk. And I'm not talking about the risk of death. I'm talking about social risk to their marriage, risk to their job, to go this way is risky, but not for the same risks that you might think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of risk, that's actually a good segue into the risks of doing a free birth. Mm-hmm. And this will obviously lead into discussing emergencies. But I think for a lot of people who have a lot of conditioning from the medical system, and again,
which is all of us.
All of us. I mean, shit.
Come on.
All of us. Yeah.
Myself included.
Sort of carry this idea and may look at, especially if this is your first time hearing about free birth, like, oh my God, that seems really, really, really risky. I don't know about that. And I want to go back to some points that you made, but then I do want you to discuss, sort of just deepen on this topic of risk associated with free birth. The one thing you said about, yes, there are natural deaths, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I apologize if I get some of the terminology wrong. There are natural deaths that occur with a free birth. But in the medical system, there are natural deaths that occur, just like there are with free birth. But then there are also murders that occur in the medical system. So that's one important note. And then the important context that I shared earlier regarding infant mortality rates in the country that has the most, again, in air quotes here, robust, highly trained, most well-funded medical systems in the world has some of the worst infant mortality rates and worst maternal mortality rates. So those are some important pieces of context. And then I'd say the third piece of context is that this is a normal biological event. Totally normal biological event. Now, with all that being said, with all the conditioning that we all have, I could see, and totally understand, and even I can see it in me sometimes. I totally acknowledge that, like where it's like, that seems so
What if?
risky. Yeah. Like what
What
if?
if?
Like, isn't it better to have someone on hand? So I guess the first part to this question is, given that we know free birth does not necessarily mean, although it does include literally going off by yourself and, birthing your baby. Is it sometimes like maybe the best way to ask this question is, do you have some women who are inside Free Birth Society or who are wanting to do a free birth that are like, I would just personally feel more comfortable with having someone there, even if they're not medically trained?
Of course.
Okay.
Well, this is what I do, right?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. And we also have women in our community who choose medical midwives.
Yeah.
Of course. It's not like a club where you have to like prove your free birth baby or something. It's not like that. People like to make up that it is, but it's really not.
No. That's helpful to hear. That's helpful to hear.
Could you imagine?
Right.
Women can't
then
do
it would
that.
be a
Men
cult.
could do
Then it might be a cult in some ways if that was the case. Right. Yeah.
Anyway, so I want to say though, to be fair, I want to go back to there is murder and natural death. I need to flesh that out with one extra point to be fair. Of course, we have to assume that there are also babies being saved. We have to assume in the system that there are some babies who without medical support wouldn't survive.
Right.
And we didn't name that, so
like preemies, for example, possibly, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
There's basically no denying, let's say a 28-week baby might, there's no guarantee, might survive with medical help.
Right.
And will not without.
Right.
The youngest I've heard of at home and staying at home is 32 weeks.
That's so young. That's so crazy.
Yeah. 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 And I hear these stories, 32, 33, 34. I've attended 32, stay at home, not just birth and then go. So anyway, so I want to just include that, part of this that I haven't said yet that we have to throw into the mix is perhaps one of the reasons that is contributing to why I haven't seen maternal death, for example, in the sovereign birth world, is that those women are transferring, and getting life support to some degree, life-saving support. So, I'm not trying to say ever that there's nothing there.
No,
right?
and that's so helpful to hear too, again, because likewise, I am not denying that I'm not saying allopathic medicine has zero place. I'm saying that for true emergencies, it is very helpful. And then maybe some specialties, if you shatter your femur, stuff like of course, it is incredible.
So obstetricians are surgeons by trade. So that they are good at surgery sometimes. They are trained in surgery. And so that's a great place to go for surgery.
Right. When you need it.
Go there if you want surgery, but you don't go to McDonald's and ask for a filet mignon and then be bummed that you got a shitty piece of meat. It's come on, you got to know where you are and read the room of where you are. Although it is tricky, arguably, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, in the industry. There's a lot of lying.
What we're getting at though, there's so much nuance to this, but I appreciate you saying that.
Well, because we have, historically the healers have been eradicated. The medicine people who maybe did know how to fix a broken bone. I don't know. They don't exist anymore. There's nowhere in my town I could go besides the hospital if my kid has a broken bone. So it's a little bit of a...
Totally.
It's tricky because the place is also, I think, fundamentally evil. Obstetrics as an industry, obstetrics is literally based on the torture and abuse of slave women. That's how... the founder of obstetrics learned all this stuff. And now obstetricians just do it to all the women. It's not like it's done. It is a torture and abuse,
There's
industry.
So many parallels with government, but I'm going to hold my tongue there. But
it's not, it is related.
It is.
They are all in the same.
I know. I'm just saying I don't want to go off on tangents, but I could draw so many parallels with government there.
So that being said, there are rare situations where the body, where mother baby, where something happens, presents, where if surgery doesn't interrupt the pregnancy, it is reasonable to think that one or both could die. I'm choosing my words really, really carefully here because I know a lot of exceptions. None of this is black and white, but there are general emergencies that you don't wait around should they present. And also, you're not that likely as a birth worker to even encounter them. They're quite rare. And then where this gets really complicated is a lot of these really rare conditions are massively overdiagnosed. And so, for example, placenta previa, that's a real condition. That is a thing that occurs in a very small number of pregnant women. However, you can only actually be properly diagnosed at term. And placenta previa is when when the placenta is obstructing the cervix. That's a real thing. And yeah, that would be one of the very few reasons that I would submit to surgery and be very grateful that I live in a time where surgery is available for this totally rare, wild thing that happened. And women are being diagnosed with that at 20 weeks. And so they're being primed for surgery at a time when you actually cannot, there's no such thing as placenta previa at 20 weeks. It literally makes no sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's one of many examples where, you know, they are, the system, obstetrics, whatever, they are taking real potential things or real things and then using it, and the dead baby card is used, you know, all the time everywhere to bring women to the result and the most efficient, expensive, you know, the most simple thing that they're literally trained to do, which is surgery. And then the NICU, oh my gosh, that's a whole nother conversation that's really intense. And I have a lot to say about that. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, yes, there's risk, but let's back up a second. So all paths have risk, right? Eating alone carries a risk. I know someone who choked and died because they ate alone at a time. You know what I'm saying? I know someone who died because they had the audacity and took that risk. They died. They choked and died in their apartment.
So crazy. It sounds so absurd in that context, but like, I'm sure largely the same could be applied to birth. And that's what you're getting at here.
And everything.
Right.
You know, you and I got on the highway to come here, and neither of us really thought about how crazy, crazy risky that was. You know, because there is accepted risk, right? There's socially acceptable risk. There's risk we're groomed into accepting all the time, you know, and then there is stuff that's not socially acceptable. You know, it's all obvious. So birth is risky. Oh my goodness, of course. And so is getting in a car. So is eating alone, you know, literally everything. And so what is interesting about this is it really is a conversation. It's more of a very subjective and kind of more spiritual, philosophical conversation of what risk are you comfortable with? What risk can you live with? So for me, I know that birthing at home, far away from any medical providers or anyone with medical training, I know for me and my children, that's the safest possible route. It's not risk-free. I would never pretend that it is. And neither is birthing in the hospital. Right. You know, duh. We've barely scratched the surface on proving that point, but hopefully it's kind of obvious. You know, you have the great risk of not having any of your human rights observed. You have a huge risk of unnecessary surgery. You have a huge risk of your baby being taken away, on and on and on and on. You're going to find people where that didn't happen, but you're going to find a lot of people where that did happen. So what risks are you willing to take for the life that you're living, right? So yes, of course there's risks. There is a small list of emergencies that are extremely rare. And I mean, we could go over them. I don't think it's that interesting. It's like they're kind of black and white. If they present,
let's hear. I think it's helpful to hear that.
Well, like we talked about. Well, so let's say uterine rupture. You know, that is literally the uterus rupturing. It would present very, very, very painful. There would likely be a lot of blood loss. That's not normal in pregnancy or in the birth process. You know, some blood, of course, but not gushing. That's different than like labor sensations. Right. You know. Placental abruption would present somewhat similarly. Some women have pain, some women don't, but there would certainly be significant blood loss. And that could be very serious, or would be very serious. Placenta previa, but that would present in the third trimester almost for sure, but it is not 100% that your body would show you signs with bleeding. What else? Cord prolapse is a popular one, though I do know popular meaning this is something that scares women. And it would be when the waters are open that a cord would fall out before the baby. And the risk of that is there could be cord compression on the cord and then cutting off oxygen to the baby, and the baby could pass. Of course, that's very scary. And if a baby wasn't immediately following the cord, then I think surgery, makes a lot of sense.
What about the one, I've heard this a number of times, and we actually know people who've experienced this, some of whom, maybe this is the answer to that question too, some of whom were not attempting a free birth, had medical providers. I don't remember if it was, whether it was in hospital or whether they were doing a home birth and had a medical midwife there. But then some that were attempting a free birth and the baby had its first bowel movement while inside the womb.
Yeah.
And then the baby ended up passing away from consuming that. And then the, mother got really sick or maybe she didn't, but the point is the baby ended up passing away in that context.
So we've got to break that down a little bit, because meconium, just as an experience, is not bad or wrong. The baby releasing its bowels in the water bag is very, very common. Both my babies did it. It's extremely common, especially if you carry to 41, 42, 43, a more mature baby. That is not indicative of anything.
Right.
Just as
in and of itself.
But this is why this stuff is so nuanced, because the things I just touched on, those are pretty black and white emergencies. Right. If this happens, you should really get surgery so that you can hopefully survive. Right. Okay. That's actually the stuff that in some way that's so obvious. It doesn't really stress me out at all. It's like, if this ever were to happen, this is what we do. What you're talking about is way more of the gray area. There is no black and white. There is no formula to this. And where one mother can have meconium and a baby will be born and survive. So it's not just meconium is what I'm getting at. Meconium just as a presence is not an issue independently. Oops, sorry. Now you said the baby died from inhaling it. And I don't think that's
I don't know that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Right?
So I don't think that's quite accurate. I think that, so when a baby is in utero, they are swallowing and they are
I'm ingesting, not inhaling, by the way.
Ingesting?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like consuming that.
So if there's meconium in the waters, when the baby comes out, that's in their mouth, that's in their, that's already in their system. They're swallowing and they have all of that stuff. They're one with everything in their, the contents of the water bag. In my opinion, meconium by itself does not scare me, although there are some times where I find it strange, and it would certainly perk my awareness. For example, if the waters opened first to begin the labor and there was a lot of meconium from the get, and it just kept coming, oh, that's interesting. That's not necessarily bad, but that's a little unusual. Okay. So, there's something I think of called the flags of 3, where a lot of this stuff by themselves can be totally normal. But when they start to stack, it would give me pause.
Right.
And so something like the presence of meconium, like I said, by itself doesn't give me pause. And I'm not scared of meconium. So when a baby is born in a undisturbed way, it is extremely unlikely that they're going to gasp and move into the whole meconium asphyxiation thing in the system. And when they're cut from their lifeline, they have no option but to gasp. Okay, so this is really important. And I wasn't at this birth. I have no idea about how this one particular story went. But also I think there was infection and there was other components to the story you're referencing. And there usually is more to the story, right? Because there's a lot going on. What is going on? There's a lot of things we have to look at, and we're still only ever going to be able to see some of the puzzle because we're also dealing with the great mystery of life and death, right? And so I see people really wanting to reduce stillbirth because I get it. I mean, they want answers. They want to avoid it.
Understandably.
Of course. Right. But in the vast majority of cases, it doesn't work that way. And it's not truthful to say this is why my baby died.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, women are welcome to say whatever they want and think. Whatever their story is their story. I don't mean to.
You're not denying the experience either.
No,
You're
and
just
then
saying,
she's
like,
allowed to have her own assessment.
No, this is a really important point to bring up too, because this, in a lot of the topics that I cover on this show to begin with, and just in general, the way that I think, you don't have to know the cause of something to know what clearly isn't the cause. And also, in addition to that, we're not, by questioning the cause, we are not saying that the effect wasn't real.
Oh my
We're
God,
not
of course.
denying the effect. We're not denying, in this case, that a baby died. We're not denying that, in any of these cases that happened. What we're saying is, can we be certain that this is the true cause of the baby dying? And that's what we're getting at.
Yeah.
And it's a touchy thing when it comes to something. It's very touchy.
I mean,
it's very touchy.
It is the elephant in the room with everything we've been talking about. It is why women willingly get in the car in the middle of her wild dance and are willing to get in a vehicle naked and be driven to a place full of strangers and an operating room. It is because she believes it will help the survival of her child.
Right.
This is why everything is, happening the way it is. So It's the elephant in the room to this entire conversation. And yeah. So we for the vast majority of stillbirths that I am aware of, including, this is true that autopsies, when done, almost never have results. They never can lock anything down, but it's just more mysterious than that. So we don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. Also, with a lot of these stories, like is it the infection that killed the baby, or was the baby ill and passed the infection? Again, this is still a little too reductive for my taste, because the mother and baby are one, and there's so much going on in this. But I work with a lot of bereaved mothers, both that birth in the system and without. And so much of what they're processing, understandably, is, how did this happen? Am I to blame? And how can I avoid this in the future? And, where I go with it is, it's a much greater conversation around being a channel, and that for the women, every woman, regardless of their birth choices, they most likely chose the path they chose because they believed it was the best environment for an optimal outcome. That doesn't mean the environment killed the baby. There is no blame, in my eyes, in the vast majority of cases. Like I told you, I've seen some kind of overt manufactured deaths, but when we're talking about naturally occurring stillbirth, which again is not that rare, you will interact with it like you have, somebody. It's not rampant, not at all. Something that I want to say here that has helped me a lot in my own choices, that my elder that I referenced earlier said to me one day, was, she said, if your baby were to die, where would you want to be? Now that's a bit of a spin, because the implication is, be in the hospital so that you have all the technology available so that you can say we did everything, right? Duh. But this is a whole other way of thinking about it from a spiritual lens. If this was this baby's contract with God, and they were never going to be earthside, and all they were ever going to come here for was to live in my womb, what would I want when I birth this baby who will not claim its life, or who has already passed? Well, I know for me, I don't want anyone touching my baby. I want time. I want as much time as I want to see every single wrinkle of that baby and to take every photo, and this is something women don't get. It's so sad how death is obviously treated, and when stillbirth happens in the system, they get a very short period of time. The baby gets taken away. They come back washed and dressed in this weird thing, and then they get taken away within a few hours, and then they get ashes a couple days later. It's so fast that they are unintegrated.
Right.
And so in a sovereign death, which will have some system involvement at some point, but if I'll just speak for myself, if my baby were to be born not living, I would kill for that time. that my husband and my children, I mean, I know I'm just thinking of so many women that I have loved and coached and supported over the years. And these stories of the time that they got with this baby, and that the older siblings got to meet this baby. They weren't just in a cement block with strangers, and the siblings never got to meet the baby that was growing, so at some period of time, well, this would be an interesting thing to talk about with you, but most people will involve the authorities to get a death certificate, because unless you have some certain stuff on your own land, the baby cannot just be buried in the earth if they're over 20 weeks. And so, but you don't have to call them right away. You could take days, is my understanding. And maybe it depends on the state, but death is a part of birth. And if you are a birth worker, you will become a death worker, whether you like it or not. And yes, this is the elephant in the room, and it happens. And so, the people I serve and the families that I work with, we talk about this. And we have to really untangle the levels of this programming that if you're in the hospital, it somehow won't happen. Now, this doesn't mean that if things were presenting as unwell, that we would not utilize the medical system. That, of course not. The mother can choose to do whatever she wants. I'm not making decisions for her, but I've actually never been in that situation. And I have attended Amish families and very conservative, sovereign families who would choose death over going into the hospital. And I'm not sure that I would make those same choices, but it's not my baby. It's not my family.
Yeah.
So it's a really emotional topic for obvious reasons, but I'm also very passionate about just thinking about what you get if you were, this is very weird to say this, but if your baby were to die, where would you want to be? And don't not think about it, have a death plan. And when you birth in the system, you get to have wool over your eyes. You don't have to think about a death plan. And so that was a huge shift in my consciousness when I started serving in a sovereign way, where I was like, oh, we have to think about this now. And mothers were thinking about it. And then I was pregnant and I was thinking about it. And I'm going to make a generalization, but I find women who choose free birth to be way more prepared to navigate death should it occur. And that doesn't mean they're more cool with it or something, they're more bring it on or something bizarre. Yeah. But they've thought about it. Right. Right. And most, when I worked in the system for 10 years, no one thought about it, but babies still died. And so there was like I said, kind of this chaotic energy around it that I see differently. I see it go differently, and doesn't mean it's not totally tragic and heartbreaking, and obviously, but I've seen women lose their babies and they still choose free birth, and because it's not free birth that killed their baby. That's the boring ass, low vibes, mainstream narrative when a baby dies in a sovereign way, because media and, cancel culture and any guards of this boring stuff are going to look for the kinks, in this. Of course.
Without failing to cite their own statistics as an example.
Well, also babies die in the system.
That's
if
my
y'all
point.
Had a foolproof plan over here, you'd have some more grounding.
That's my total point is that. Exactly.
If you guys have figured it out, let us know. Yeah. So it is ultimately, back to risk, worthy as a spiritual quest to explore. What do you want? What do you trust? And if it were to go this way, how would you feel? And if it were can you handle your baby passing in your home? And I know some people are like, hell no, I need to know that the NICU was there and we tried everything with technology. I don't feel that way personally. That doesn't mean I wouldn't utilize it if I thought it would help. Not at all. But it is a high priority for me that I birth my children in my home and assess. And perhaps I would then, if my baby wasn't doing well and I thought there was something specific in the NICU that could support my child and it was worth all of the cost of going and separating and having no rights against my, with my baby and all of that, yeah, I would consider it, of course. But it's a complicated conversation. And the biggest issue, I think, is that no one knows anything about this.
Right.
No one knows anything about birth or how the system plays.
Right.
And so it's a pretty like low level conversation for most people. And they're outsourcing all of their decision making because of those two things.
Well, that's what it's so funny you say outsourcing decision making, because even just hearing your thought process around this, it sounds like you've thought about and discussed this with other people so much. And what that is indicating to me is how much more sovereign you are in your own decision making and empowered you are, especially on the back end of having two births like this, right? I guess just you've really come to reclaim your own power by adopting this way of being.
I never lost it.
You never, not even reclaim. You never gave away your power. You've maintained your own power. But for those who have given it away at certain points, this is a way to reclaim that power and become a sovereign woman, right? And it's not to say, again, we're not saying better or worse with respect to wherever you fall within the spectrum of birthing options. Ultimately, what you do is, like we said towards the beginning of this conversation, you give the full spectrum of options. You educate on all things related to each. And then the true sovereign woman is someone who is understanding of all of those possibilities, and then they make their own decision that is best for them. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes. And what is challenging about this path, and just comes with the territory, is people will free birth thinking they get this and then have a undesired outcome, and it's my fault somehow. And it's Free Birth Society's fault because they didn't actually ever understand anything about self-authority and responsibility. So the quest, the understanding something intellectually and actually walking the walk as an integrated person are two very different things, right? And so I accept that. Like, that is a part of me being like the what's the term, poster child for all of this. But there are still women free birthing who I would not say are sovereign women because it's an inside job, right? And any woman with a uterus and a baby can drop a baby. Like, all that's required for this free birth, this like big, thing that's like, changed Instagram and all of this stuff. Literally all that's required is a uterus and a baby and a vagina. Yeah. And then it can happen, know? So it's very simple stuff that we're talking about, but there's an enormous amount of self-sabotage involved in people's lives. And the vast majority of people have no concept of self-responsibility. So I think I need to like balance that, because you could totally free birth and not have an understanding of sovereignty whatsoever.
In Free Birth Society, I'd imagine, I mean, I'm not in it, does a good job of educating on all these things. And that's kind of what I was alluding to before. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a childbirth education program that's self-study for parents, and it's called The Complete Guide to Free Birth, and people love it. And it's mostly Yolanda and I just philosophizing on all of this stuff and breaking it all down. I mean, there's lots of science and stuff in it too, but that's amazing. And it's self-study, and people all over the world have done that. Our free resources is the podcast, which is 8 seasons of women, and I get on there every now and then and do my own thing. There's a great one for fathers to wrap their head around what all of this crazy stuff is. And then I also teach a midwifery school for women who are drawn to supporting women. And honestly, I will say it is complicated to teach this stuff because fundamentally, like I said this to you earlier, someone hiring a birth professional, can that be done truly non-hierarchically? Can that be done in true self-responsibility?
Right.
I don't know.
Are you outsourcing some of your power with that?
Yeah.
Right. But is that necessarily, like, again, this is not bad or good, no judgment on it, but like, are you fully sovereign if you are outsourcing even to a non-medical midwife? And like, what's incredible, what I really appreciate about that is you are someone who attends birth as a non-medical midwife, as a true midwife. And even you are saying is that truly?
Well, because lots of families I serve definitely still put me on pedestal. Definitely, if I were willing to come in and just like make decisions and call the shots, and they would definitely just listen to me. But I have done years and years and years of figuring out, my own internal landscape to not do that.
Right.
So that when a woman wants to give me her power, I know how to not take it and to put it back. And that requires a lot of relationship with my ego and the part of me that wants to help and the part of me that is uncomfortable with her sounding like she's being burned alive. And, there's a lot. It's a really shamanic, complex space to hold. Nervous father, you're there, they're looking at you, asking what you should do. And how do you hold all of that and also not be the authority?
Right. Well, here's what I think. And it all goes back to, in my mind, again, like every episode comes back to this, the biofield in water. And what I mean by that is, even if you are doing your job to push the authority back onto them, which I'd imagine you do, like you said, it's your presence there by just being incredibly knowledgeable on this topic and being sovereign in yourself. Just by being there in some cases, and this is where I could see where someone might not want to birth totally unassisted. Right. Your presence, just the presence of that, even if you don't say anything at all, is such a strong, coherent field as it pertains to this paradigm that it invites those individuals to take back their own sovereignty in that case, or it could possibly
it's
do
Jedi
that.
Shit.
Yeah, it's Jedi.
It really
it's Jedi
is.
shit. Exactly.
This line that Yolanda teaches in our school, I want to say here because it's perfect, is it's about learning to be responsible to the women we're serving, but not responsible for.
Right.
And so we call that non-hierarchical midwifery. But I will be honest with you, most people I serve, I don't think they really understand that. But as long as I understand it, hopefully we'll be okay.
You can Jedi that shit. Yeah.
And so good. It is complicated to teach this stuff to women for whatever stage they're at. But for me, I just keep coming back to women want women at their births. And a lot of women increasingly do not want medical providers. And so I am willing to do my best to teach these women how I do it, why I do it. And I also want to admit, this is a very fresh movement in some ways at the scale in which it is right now. And so there is, what's the right word? There is a cost to the newness. There is ignorance still that women are relearning their bodies after generations of not even knowing how to tell if they're fertile, not even knowing how to prevent pregnancy, not even feeling their bodies. So many people are so numb and disassociated, and then they might move into this. So this is a spiritual, journey that has as many variations as there are women, and I just can't generalize any of this really and do it justice, because birth is a biological event. You can make it a medical event if you want. There's a whole billion-dollar industry that would love to make it a medical event. And you also, what I advocate for is for any woman listening to know that you can make it a medical event. You also can choose for it not to be, and you can connect to your animal, she bear, as again, I want to reference my elder. She told me one time that when someone asked her, hey, how can I really learn how to have a birth in power? She said, poop in the woods. Just poop in the woods. That's it. That was her advice. Wow. And I really thought about that a lot. I was like, that's a pretty badass piece of advice, because who do we know? What pregnant chick out there in America that's her prenatal care?
Not many.
In the woods, but there is something to that, because if you can go out to the woods and be comfortable pooping in the woods, the chances that you will allow a baby to come out of you without dramatizing it and sabotaging it is pretty high.
Wow. Didn't think we'd end there, but
we could.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was good. Emilee, thank you so much for joining me. This was awesome. And for those who are interested in everything Emilee offers, you can, of course, just check the show notes. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here.